which is going to be the first of several probably little tweaks and experiments to this series, starting with the fact that this is going to be covering since Friday's worth of video game news, and next Wednesday the plan is to cover all the way past today, so any new news would be covered at that point. The reasoning for that I've talked about in the past, and frankly I want to just jump into the news to begin with, so I'm not even going to get too much into any kind of warm-up or anything. We're going to jump into the Gematsu articles. That's another change I'm going to make, starting with Gematsu articles, then we'll look at Video Games Chronicle articles, then down through the list of our other news sources, and then we'll see how I feel about doing some of the other stuff that would have been part of the warm-up section. I can say today is going to be heavily about Gamescom opening night live announcements in the first few hours of Gamescom as far as the news goes. But there is also Dolly Parton and Tim Curry just passed away, both I believe 80 years old, which is a good long time. Tim Curry I know was in the Red Alert series, I believe Red Alert 2, and I can't actually name it, but I'm fairly certain that Dolly Parton used her likeness in some sort of educational game from maybe the 90s or 80s, but there isn't, as far as I know, any specific video game tie-in to her passing. The only thing I can really say is that it did seem like both of them were in slightly worse off positions a couple years ago, and they got a little bit better, but that is somewhat typical for people who do pass away from old age in particular, is that you get this honeymoon spot where the body stops trying to heal itself, and in the process of stop trying to heal itself, it's not taking as much energy away from just normal day-to-day operations. So you very often will hear stories of people being more lucid when they had dementia for 24 hours before they pass away, although there is also a survivorship bias in those stories, if they aren't just completely made up sometimes, and that nobody tells the story where somebody has dementia and they're just as demented and crazy as they always have been. Yeah, so in the next stream we'll probably cover a lot more Gamescom. So this was kind of a terrible time to try and compress all news down to a week instead of what I was doing before, which was Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Now I'm just doing Wednesday, specifically targeting 5 p.m. US Central Time, and having the videos actually air at that time because I'm recording to tape. So this is mostly live to tape, but I am going to try and do some more pausing, maybe take more breaks, and just have a more concise setup. So that's what's changing, and I think that's more than enough warm-up to go. So we'll go through the Gematsu stories. Well, that jumps me back to the other one. So I went through all of these stories before to try to close some of the redundant things and close things that probably don't matter as much. One of the things I'm going to try to avoid is things that aren't really anything much more than a listicle. Technically, Koei Tecmo's announcing its Tokyo Game Show lineup is very close to a listicle, so you can see that there is a list of things here, and we will almost certainly get individual posts about all these games as we get closer to Tokyo Game Show. Yeah, and I suppose we might as well just go through this Video Games Chronicle article since it keeps jumping back in that direction. Nintendo took down a GitHub project, and when you take down the parent version of a open source project in GitHub, it takes down all of the forks, the make your own version of it, do slight changes of it. So that's how you get a really high number, like more than 400 emulator repositories, as it literally means they did a DMCA takedown of one or two main projects, and then a ton of forks of people who would have forked it for all kinds of different reasons. One of the reasons I think people would think about forking a project is to think that that would make it a safe backup copy, but it doesn't really work that way. In fact, even if you just downloaded the entire repository from GitHub and then made a whole new project and uploaded that repository, then almost certainly would still be caught by Microsoft owned GitHub anyways. Yeah, so certainly GitHub is not the place to think you have safe backups, or it's the place to have your only copy of a backup. Most of these were just Suyu emulator forks, the successor, one of the successors to Yuzu, Switch emulator, which, yeah, it is surprising how the gap between when a game system comes out and when it can be played on the emulator is getting smaller and smaller, as game systems in general are now just computers and nowhere as difficult to emulate as, say, the Nintendo 64, which is notoriously difficult to emulate. You can get pretty decent experiences emulating the Nintendo Switch on a Steam Deck, and that is something that's fairly surprising. Although it is also worth pointing out that Switch 1, he's probably 6 or 7 years old at this point, so it isn't a spring chicken, and the technology in the Switch 1 is potentially closer to 10 to 12 years old, and wasn't very powerful to begin with. Switch 2 arguably isn't much more powerful, so I wouldn't be surprised if emulation for Switch 2 games is very much on the same level. Meanwhile, I suppose it is worth mentioning that Nintendo hasn't announced any new games lately. So they are spending their time and their lawyers' time and their money shutting down open source emulation projects instead of paying the second party developers that they use to actually make games. Sonic Racing Crossworlds Axel content update is now available. This is Axel from Crazy Taxi Remake, which, yeah, I don't know how many characters in the Crazy Taxi Remake are actually available compared to the original game, but it definitely feels like to me there's fewer characters that you can play as in the remake than in the original game. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt Remastered has been announced for modern consoles and PC. By modern consoles, I mean Xbox Series, Switch 2, PC, PlayStation 5. The expansion Songs of the Past teaser trailer has also been shown. As far as I understand it, this is supposed to be a free update for anybody who has The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. It might give me somewhat of an excuse to try and go back and play the Heart and Stone expansion, which I never did, or this new expansion. But yeah, I wouldn't expect it to be too much of a improvement. It'll just be Witcher 3 running on newer version of Unreal using the newer code that they're making Witcher 4 with. Apparently also all current owners of Witcher 3 get the original 2 expansions, Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine, for free, which I really have gone full circle now as far as buying games and literally not getting around to playing them, to the point where things that I bought I could have literally gotten for free, and I could have gotten a remastered version in this case for free. This doesn't happen that often, but it does happen every now and then. And certainly there is also a problem though, and I think people may really find out in a nasty way is as they try to make content for the Witcher 3 Wild Hunt on YouTube, that they're gonna just run into a whole bunch of community guideline strikes that YouTube probably was more lenient on when this game first came out. There is a bit of nudity here and there in Witcher 3, and that's what YouTube is mostly against, but even violence and blood might be a thing. It also creates a weird situation in that there was a pretty lackluster response to the trailer of Witcher 4, and so now it seems like they're leaning on The Witcher 3 to try to get people back into loving the Witcher series, which, let's be honest, most people didn't play Witcher 1 and Witcher 2, which were fairly different games than Witcher 3. I think I only played Witcher 2, and Geralt of Rivia was a very different character in that game. But yeah, people generally, I think, just didn't like them bringing back Ciri. I believe that's her name, this character's, in Witcher 4, because her story basically wrapped up very nicely at the end of Witcher 3, and everybody's story wrapped up fairly nicely, and they were hoping to see a new character. Now, some people will claim that they were hoping to see, that gamers in general were hoping to see a new male protagonist and not a female protagonist, but I would toss that argument in the garbage at this point, because I think there are better arguments to be made instead of just immediately knee-jerk cries of sexism. But certainly it is also worth pointing out that there are a lot of people around the world that don't want to play as a female protagonist. It's not just the Western world. It's not just even men or males. Let's see. We can see the rating of Sonic Racing Crossworld. Some of these tabs are still probably out in the wrong place, and I'm still having lots of problems with my whole setup. I did find out what was wrong with my macros, and so I was able to run them again. UI Vision, the extension that I'm using at the moment and going to desperately try to replace in the next couple of weeks, completely changed its software and required a completely new install and gave no warning to it for it to continue to work. Which, yeah, that's pretty unacceptable. By the way, if this happens to be the first video you see, which that is the hope, is we'll get a whole bunch of new viewers, I have several Violent Monkey scripts that are changing how things look here to get this vertical format. One of the things it is doing is speeding up the slideshows on Steam pages, so I don't spend as much time looking at games. I would assume none of this screenshots are of the remastered version of the game. Yeah, but obviously it's overwhelmingly positive. I wonder what games exist out there that are much more close to 100% positivity. Although this also is one that claims it was review bombed at some point, or as Steam calls it, one or more periods of off-topic review activity, which I've never really seen a lot of review bombs actually be off-topic. That they usually are talking about something that very much affects that individual's experience of the game. Moving on, Final Fantasy VII Revelation, the Planet Crisis trailer screenshots. Face the legendary weapon. This might be a remaking of a trailer that came out for the original version of the game. I'm not sure. But yeah, it is going to be fairly pointless to look at trailers today. That would be a huge waste of time. And we don't have a release date yet on Steam, which means it's not going to be added to my fall list. Let's see, NCSoft announces a team-based survival first-person shooter called Like or Die for PC, which sounds very close to the game Live or Die, but I don't really think it's connected. And yeah, I think it would be fairly silly to assume that there's going to be anything amazing about this game at this point. It is interesting how they have an entire character's face covered up with the logo. Yeah. I suppose it would be interesting if there is a what am I trying to say? If there's a shift for more of these live service team-based things coming from like Korea. Krafton announces an Eastern dark fantasy action RPG called Terre, or at least that's what I'm going to assume that's how that's pronounced, The Unbound, for PS5, Xbox Series, and PC. We were just looking at that on Steam. Yeah. Which, yeah, I guess if it's just been announced, I will hit a hotkey to take some data down in case I'm going to make YouTube shorts around new games, which I'm still debating whether I'm going to do that or not. Roko Kingdom global version has been announced for PS5, Xbox Series, PC, iOS, and Android. Quack test signups are now available. Yeah, I'm gonna just spend all of today fighting tabs that are just gonna jump around, unfortunately. I believe this game, There Are No Ghosts at the Grand, has been announced, although I kind of feel like it may have been announced before. Yeah, the deeper bit of information is that it launches in early access for PC in December. It's calling it a musical Lovecraftian renovator. Inherently, this is the problem with Gamescom and all of these big events. This is why I don't even waste time watching those kinds of presentations, Opening Night Live, Summer Games Fest, Video Game Awards. All of them just take way too long and squish a whole bunch of trailers and a whole bunch of really small announcements as far as It's coming out in this year, it's coming out in this quarter, it's coming out in this month. It squishes all of that information that individually packaged would be a nice little headline to see if you only saw a couple day to day. But it squishes it into a 2-3 hour presentation and makes it so overwhelming and makes every single trailer irrelevant. It's funny, people are paying up to $500,000, I believe, to put their trailers in some of these Jeff Keighley presentations, in particular, and they almost certainly are devaluing their own trailers because they're putting it right next to each other. Unlike other times when you would buy commercials, there was at least a point in time that Bud Light was buying the rights to be the only beer running commercials during the Super Bowl. You wouldn't have the multiple beer companies advertising against each other, and you would have some other companies that would do similar things, and you would definitely have kind of sponsored ad things where you would be the official advertisement for certain events. But yeah, Game Awards don't do any of that, and really couldn't do any of that, because at best there's no Ghost at the Grand, to pick a random game, could be the official interactive supernatural game of the presentation, but even that really wouldn't work. It would have to be, you would have to be so different in your game to stand out, and video games just don't stand out that much, that particularly when the big ones tend to all be first-person shooters with live services these days, or at least they try to have live services. Zoopunk Gamescom 2026 trailer and screenshots are available on Gamatsu if you want to check that out. Inherently, a lot of these trailers and screenshots are going to require you to just go to Gamatsu if they interest you. Pony Island 2 Panda Circus was announced, which looks very different from the screenshots of Pony Island 1. That is yet another game I never got around to actually playing, although in all honesty I could probably say that to about a dozen things. This game onto nose looks creepy, kind of a little Bioshocky. We've had a lot of games that try to evoke some of the feeling of Bioshock, but you never know how the game actually plays. Yeah, this one says it's a sci-fi thriller puzzle immersive sim first-person game, so yeah, it's not going to have that kind of running and gunning that Bioshock have. This gameplay trailer would probably give me a better understanding of how you actually play, but we have absolutely no time for it today. Today in particular is going to be me trying to rush through everything. A game called No Law launches in 2027. It's a first-person story-rich cyber noir shooter for PlayStation 5, Xbox Series, and PC via Steam, Epic Game Store, and Microsoft Store. That is kind of interesting because usually Gamatsu is very specific in how they do their subheadlines, and they will mention what systems the game is being released on, and they didn't do that this time. They went below the fold, as it were, which, yeah, below the fold is a newspaper reference where the front page would be folded, and everything you would see, the way they were bundled and sold, would be above the fold, and anything below the fold is a little less important. Of course, it's still pretty important because it's on the front page, though. No law. Has no release date. Next we have this Cinder City game that also has no release date. Cinder City's story teaser trailer plus a new NVIDIA DLS 4.5 trailer is available. It's apparently an open world, massively multiplayer online shooter, third-person shooter game. And I will leave it at that. Now I believe we had rumors for a LEGO Skylines game. I couldn't really play Skylines. First of all, the user interface was too small for my eyesight at the time. I've since gotten glasses, but even then the user interface was pretty small from me looking at the game from probably 8 feet away at the time. I've moved my chair closer to the monitor, so now it's closer to 3 feet. But also, the management city aspect really didn't interest me. Now, I do feel like it is kind of interesting to see if you could convince kids. I assume that's your target with LEGO. That may very well be wrong, considering how expensive LEGO is these days. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see if kids got into city LEGO Skylines. But I wouldn't expect too much from it. I don't know how Lego-y really you can make the cities, and I imagine a lot of these elements are going to be pre-made buildings, and you aren't going to have any like construction aspect. Lego is very much opening up what it will license its name to, where previously it was very much TT Games, a subsidiary of WB Games, that was making the traditional LEGO Star Wars type games. And even the LEGO Star Wars type games really didn't have a ton of crafting as far as actually building Legos. Yeah, these screenshots look nice. Sure, I will say that much, but it is still almost certainly going to just be city skylines under the hood. Maybe it'll be a little bit easier of a game because it's supposedly targeting kids. It's rated E for everyone, or at least, yeah, I guess it's already been rated. But even an easier city sim game still is a city sim game, and I don't think I would go out of my way to try and play this LEGO game, despite the fact that I've played a lot of other ones. So once again, we have a situation where an older version of a game that people are very nostalgic for has been announced and shown off to really build hype for the newer Heroes of Might Magic game. Unless it is a case in this that they are just sneakily renaming the newer game, which I think was called just Heroes of Might Magic, Heroes of Odin or something like that, and didn't have a number after it, which if it did have a number after it and I'm misremembering, it would be 6 or 7 in the series. But yeah, this is just being called Heroes of Might and Magic 3 Remake. I definitely remember spending a lot of time playing Heroes of Might and Magic Gold, which had a whole bunch of extra missions and maps and was a super long game, which may very well hinder anybody's enjoyment of this remake, even if you do have some nostalgic for playing them in the past. The reality of just how long they take in modern times may be too much. Yeah, there's, says the complete campaign saga and online and things like that. This again is probably a scenario where they were able to remake the old game pretty easily because they were running code for a newer game. There's a lot of systems in Heroes of Might and Magic 3 that it'll have to stay true to, as far as the spells you can cast and the creatures you can summon. And so none of that can really change in the old game. So yeah, you really can only go so far. Yeah, it says it's coming with its 2 expansions, which I don't know what the first expansion was, but gold seemed to include everything, unless I'm really mistaken. Everything in 4K may not really matter as much, because that would just zoom out the screen even more in a lot of cases, making the characters even more pixely. Suffice it to say, if we look at these screenshots, this is not what Heroes of Might and Magic looked like originally. This is your main gameplay mechanic, where you have your units fighting against enemy units, and each character represents potentially hundreds of the same unit. And you can cast spells. The other part of the game is wandering around the map. And I guess the third part of the game is being inside your city and upgrading your city. And as you upgrade your city, you can recruit more people to fight on your side, but then you have to actually go back to the city and transfer them into your army, which probably is a little old-fashioned for a way for a game to work. This looks very pretty, but this menu is basically just a menu. You click on specific buildings and you go through a menu to summon things, and that is that. This is the overworld map, or at least one of many. And yes, it looks a lot prettier, but you are just controlling your captain, I believe they're called captains, as you're going around the map to different places to get resources, maybe to fight encounters, maybe to get people to join your side, or to find obelisks, which some of the missions you have to find a specific hidden thing on the map, and the only way to do it, I believe, is to find all the obelisks. Heroes of Might and Magic 3 was a very early 90s mouse, and maybe a little keyboard, but mostly mouse game, and it is very much constrained in that way. It would be fairly crazy for you to try and play this with controllers, which I don't know if there is any controller support. I don't see any evidence that that is the case. So yeah, again, it's going to feel weird. Now here's Heroes 3 Complete, which it came out August 25, 2026. I think it's worth looking at. And here is Heroes of Might and Magic Olden Era. There are other Might and Magic games, supposedly all in the same universe. I don't think the world building is really that big of a deal. The one I would suggest as far as Might and Magic other games would be Might and Magic Clash of Heroes, which is an interesting strategy game. But yeah, the Heroes of series in particular stood out as far as the series goes. And Might and Magic certainly didn't succeed anywhere as well as Dungeons and Dragons did, which, yeah, I don't believe it is part of the Dungeons and Dragons universe. This game being announced and this game coming out might very well also be a reflection of Ubisoft being kind of desperate to make money and to keep people happy and actually release things, because I imagine a lot of employees at Ubisoft are on a razor's edge of being laid off. But yeah, the new game, Heroes of Might and Magic Golden Era, is a official prequel calling back to the origins of the game, defining critically acclaimed series. It being a prequel, though, still probably means it will be way more modern, just here and there with little tweaks as far as what you can do, compared to Heroes of Might and Magic 3. But yeah, Heroes of Might and Magic 5, Hammers of Fate, doesn't even look like the same game. Yeah, with only 4 screenshots to show, this feels like they drastically tried to change it and put the Heroes name on it. It is rated very positively, but very few reviews for something that's a 20-year-old game. Whereas the Heroes 3, this shows what the resolution and what the interface looked like originally. But yeah, there are some slight changes, and obviously the graphics are much older. But I don't think the actual experience is going to change too much. What could change is some of these buttons are for just like waiting or going back to your home base, just automating processes. So some of that may be optimized a little bit. There could really be a lot of balance too, where easy modes or easy versions of the original version of Heroes 3 might be way better than they may just be the default difficulty and the only difficulty in the remake, in the remaster. Armageddon's Blade and the Shadow of Death are the 2 expansions. There is also a positively reviewed mod, so potentially it could also be the case that the HD mod has pushed this remaster. But you could also see, like, here's another one. There's a lot of these. There's an issue. I have like the original version of this, not the definitive version. That's why it's on my wish list. I'm debating about whether I would ever actually rebuy things. So yeah, you have like a 2027 remake of Heroes 3 versus the HD version, which came out in 2015, versus the original version, unadulterated, which came out in 2026. And yeah, I just don't know if you need to really pay and pay again and pay again for the same game just being sold once again. Here we can see another Heroes of Might and Magic, although this is called Might and Magic Heroes 7, and yeah, it looks very different. Clearly they wanted to try to modernize this series and failed, and they probably have been trying for 10 years to figure out how to modernize the series and still probably haven't really figured it out. But yeah, I don't see a reason why you would want to buy the original version when the HD version seems to still let you have the feel and the visuals of the original game with slight improvements in graphics. And that's also the problem with this new remastered version too, is that do we need a remaster for a game like this every 10 years? That is fairly questionable. This looks great. And these screenshots actually show off a lot more of what the game actually is than any of the other game screenshots. So yeah, I'd say Ubisoft is really dropping it. These are all the spells you can unlock. And this is the obelisk puzzle, or at least one of them, that you have to reveal by visiting the obelisks. In that case, they look like this. Yeah, if you were fully on remaking Heroes 3 and not just remastering it, you could see how this map has like a pile of gold here and a pile of gold here and a treasure chest here. I think that's maybe an artifact. There's just a ton of stuff on the maps originally in Heroes 3, and a way to modernize that certainly would be to reduce the number of items you pick up on the map individually and increase the amount of resources you get for picking up those items. Plus, this is kind of a crazy game in that it has a ton of different resources. All of them are in-game resources. You don't have to pay any kind of microtransactions or anything for them, which you might be expected to think that they would try to add something like that into a game like this, but no, thank goodness. Although Heroes of Might and Magic would be a really decent mobile game if it wasn't greedy. I'm pretty sure Ubisoft would make it in a very greedy way. But yeah, wood and ore and I think coal, sulfur, gems. I can barely even read it. But yeah, all kinds of numbers, all kinds of role-playing stuff that honestly you didn't really have to become too smart about that. You would just try and see if you won or not. And every turn I believe saved, so this was a very early save scumming game. This is the mini map showing generally just how large the maps are, and they are typically huge. This little square here representing just that much. So you can see that there's 15 or so squares in total on the whole map. And then there's a lot of maps. A lot of maps with different goals. A lot of things that you would expect something in for like a Diablo game where you're equipping weapons to your and items to your captain. I believe they're called the captain. And I believe what is this guy called? A Dementor? Yeah. The eyeball guy I think is actually copyrighted by Dungeons and Dragons. So I wouldn't be surprised if Might and Magic is somehow licensed as a spin-off of Dungeons and Dragons, where skeletons and Medusas and dragons and harpies are all very much public domain characters. I think the eyeball Dementor character is a unique creation. I could be wrong about that. That is way too much time though to be spending to talk about any game for today. Suffice it to say, I do have a certain love for Heroes 3. But it doesn't really go much further than that. Maybe I played Heroes 4, maybe I went back and played Heroes 2, but I definitely forgot about the series and moved on to other things after one, maybe two glorious summers of playing Heroes of Might and Magic 3. Certainly it was also a game that was in an era where the internet didn't exist, and so a lot of the fun you might have with it would be two-player not co-op, player versus player on the same computer. So you would play your turn and then the person sitting next to you would play their turn, and so that's going to be highly reliant on whether you have somebody sitting next to you as far as how much fun you're going to have. Certainly, Heroes of Might and Magic is a major percentage of my misspent youth playing video games. I spent a ton of time playing it. It also had interesting, fairly calming operatic music, and I would say every single game developer out there should listen to the music soundtrack of Heroes of Might and Magic 3 and realize that that is the kind of music you should have in almost every situation when playing a game. And you should have as much music as that did too, because it was really long and it went on and had a lot of variety. It didn't get repetitive, it didn't get boring, it wasn't so high energy that it was in your face and distracting, and it wasn't so low energy that it would make you fall asleep. Whereas I'm playing a game called The Artisan of Glimeth at the moment, and it feels like that game has only 3 songs, one of which is Have You Been to Scarborough Fair, which is far too distinctive and recognizable of a song to have in a game, and it just cycles through them, and they're kind of low energy songs, but not particularly calming enough songs for the massive amount of puzzles that is in The Artisan of Glimeth. And that game really just has way too many puzzles. I think I'm going to hit somewhere between 750 and 1,000 puzzles when I'm done with it, and I will probably only really like 4 or 5 of them because they're all very derivative of each other and fairly annoying. Moving on, Path of Exile 2 launches December 11th. It's currently in early access. Okay. This says it has a release date of December 6, 2024, but I have an added icon here. That's another one of my Violent Monkey scripts that adds the early button there, so I don't have to scroll down to see it's in early access. It is rated very positively, mostly positive, but it is very much the case that once something finally says it's not in early access, people start holding it to a very different standard, and you often see the reviews tank and go down unless they really have a solid final product to offer. The other problem with this game is that it's an MMO first and foremost, I'm pretty sure. And so, while I might be able to play it in single player, which it says you can, I don't know if I really trust that. So, move at this point for me is to put this on the fall list and evaluate it after it comes out and see what the reviews say and find more information, which is all stuff I can't really do at the moment. So we'll move on. Level Infinite and Behavior Interactive have announced a blue-collar sci-fi co-op third-person shooter called Exterminauts for PS5, Xbox Series, and PC. That is a lot of descriptive terms. They're blue-collar sci-fi co-op third-person shooter. When I hear blue-collar sci-fi, I think of Red Dwarf, which there was a couple of Red Dwarf games made, but they are awful. Absolutely awful. There definitely should be more made than have been made. And we don't really have a launch date or anything, so there's very little to act on. There's another problem with these events like Gamescom, is that there really is just no actionable activity you can do. You could put this on your wish list and follow list, but you'll probably forget the game even exists by the time it actually comes out. You don't have a release date to add it to a calendar. You don't have user reviews to look at. You can put it on the follow list. Steam's follow list only holds 3,000 or 4,000 games though, so that works only if you're minimally using Steam. Moving on, Transport Fever 3 launches September 29th, which at least that is somewhat actionable in that we have a date to set on the calendar now. And Steam has its own release calendar thing it's doing, which I'm still debating whether that's actually helpful in any way. A co-op action builder, Gravehounds, has been announced for Xbox Series and PC. It's due out in early access on November 2nd. Which visually it looks a little bit different because you're playing as anthropomorphic animals. That's pretty much all though I can say at the moment. Turok Origins has been delayed to spring of 2027, no longer due out this fall, probably in part to avoid coming out too close to GTA. I don't really have a ton of high hopes for Turok Origins, but I also don't know what the audience really wants for Turok games in the first place. So Turok Origins might very well be what people want. My thought for a game called Turok would be that you would have been fighting aliens with more bows and arrows and Native American warrior spirit guile, stuff like that, not laser guns and armor. This looks too much just like Doom ripoff, and I don't think Turok ever really was supposed to be just a Quake or Doom ripoff. We are very much also getting continuations, remakes, re-releases, remasters of very old games that often were top 3 at best, top 4, top 5, maybe barely scraping the top 10 game of that week when they came out, and that they were just not the most popular games. And that is an interesting thought, certainly, as far as with the massive amount of layoffs happening for game developers. Will we see more or less, or does it affect it in any way at all, of people running out of ideas and just trying to remake old games? I think we'll probably have just about the same amount, because people who get laid off and start a new company or start a new company for themselves aren't going to have the rights to old games. Meanwhile, the Microsofts out there that laid off a bunch of people are probably still going to be desperate for money, and so they are going to greenlight cheap, easy remasters. Yeah. And I imagine we will have a wave of just AI visual remasters at some point in the next decade, where barely 1 or 2 people even look at the game, and it is just the entire video code and source code is shoved into an AI upscaling feature that they will then resell the same game for. Moving on, Crazy Taxi World Tour multiplayer first look trailer and screenshots are available. Again, if I had more time, I might watch this. It is interesting that they say screenshots are available, but then I'm not seeing any screenshots. Now I know there's a lot of code on this webpage that I'm hiding, so it's possible I accidentally hid some screenshots I didn't mean to. But all I could really do is check on that and see if that's the case later. I half suspect it's not the case, and what really is going on is Gamatsu, being run by one person, put screenshots in the title and plans to come back later and add the screenshots and just hope that people who visited it in the first couple hours don't notice. This is slightly surprising, particularly since I know Linus Tech Tips just showed how you would play an open source Guitar Hero type game and get old Wii guitars to work with PC, which, yeah, I do have a fantasy in my mind of doing a gamer meetup at some point in the next few years, and one of the thoughts certainly was to have a Guitar Hero setup, but it's fairly expensive, and personally I don't play Guitar Hero, so it also would be quite the investment just for a once a month meetup, which, yeah, that would probably be about as often as you could have it. This potentially changes things, but only somewhat for me, and it almost certainly changes things for anybody who actually was good at playing Guitar Hero and wants to relive that nostalgia. With the announcement of Stage Tour launching December 10th, it's going to feature over 90 songs and a game and guitar bundle. I believe the guitar is with the game bundled for $100, which in modern expenses doesn't even seem that difficult. It seems like this being called Stage Tour de-emphasizes the guitar, and you can also play with drums and a microphone and a gamepad. I don't know if you could do like the guitar riffs with a microphone or the drums or the gamepad. Probably you could do the guitar riffs with the gamepad, but I don't know if you could do the microphone parts with the gamepad. I don't know how you'd really do that. So there's a decent amount of questions to ask. You are, though, still buying into a game where it is having to license the music, and the way the law works in the United States is just crazy, in that there seems to be absolutely no way to actually license music in perpetuity forever or even for 100 years. And so almost certainly 5-10 years from now, this game will be taken down, and fingers crossed you can play it if you owned it before, but very possibly not the case. Whereas the open source projects, I assume, are very much bring your own music, and they just have a database that adds the note tracks to play to match that music. So the open source options, which I know of two, exist. Yet another rhythm game was the one Linus Tech Tips was showing off most recently. But yeah, if you're doing an open source thing, you're bringing your own music, you're going to have control over that a lot better. And yeah, I don't listen to music, so while I can recognize some of these songs and some of these performers, I probably wouldn't recognize a lot of them. I don't recognize Good Kid. I don't recognize Mimi's Delivery Service. A lot of songs actually don't have their headlines really match what the songs sound like, or the lyrics on the songs sound like. I'm one of those weirdos that also, because I don't really understand and appreciate music that much, probably listens to the actual lyrics of songs, which often are either horrific or just nonsensical. And that would be where I would recognize it. I don't really expect that this will play much different. I imagine the last Guitar Hero games that were made, which may have been a long time ago, worked perfectly fine. Seems like there might be some unlockables, and yeah, they're showing off 3 guitars that will be available, and then a drum kit. Yeah, if I really was going to get this for some kind of experience for a gamer meetup, you would be taking up a lot of space to have the guitars and the drum kits going. And yeah, I don't think this game would just let you have real guitars or real drum kits and plug that into the audio in or the MIDI input on a computer, which I feel like really rhythm games should just work that way. Particularly MIDI would make a lot of sense. But yeah, if you just want the game, which I don't know how much you could really do with the game, it's going to be $40. If you want the bundle with the official Kramer guitar controller and the full stage tour game, that's $130. You're also going to get a comic book if you pre-order it as a pre-order bonus, which they're pushing that. You can bundle multiple pieces of the stage tour, including the stage tour band kit game bundle for $300. Yeah. So that would be probably the guitar, the drum kit, the wireless microphone, and maybe a wired microphone too. Or maybe only one. Yeah. I think you want to go wireless because you're not really going for huge quality here. And then there's gonna probably be even more expensive special versions of the guitars. We kind of know though that these guitars are likely going to disappear and end up in Goodwills and charity shops, thrift shops in the next 5 or 10 years. So if you just waited, you may find a resurgence of more of these modern controllers that might work with PC, or you'll have to be careful because I wouldn't be surprised if there are different versions of this that are for Switch and well, Switch 2, PlayStation 5, and Xbox. There could be very different versions for all of these, although there really is no reason in this case. This is one of the modern advantages that exists now that wouldn't have existed then, is that all of these devices really should just be USB, and they should all, and one guitar should work for all of them. So yeah, that's something of interest, and apparently I saw this already and put this on the follow list at some point. But I don't know if I can fully say this is the way to go. And yeah, if you're going to pre-order this on Steam, you do run into that problem of probably not getting the hardware. Like, the only hardware Steam has ever sold was Steam machines, and the Steam frame isn't out yet, Steam Decks. But yeah, we haven't had third-party developers sell hardware, so this is kind of a weird place to buy it. And certainly that is another question to ask, is where in the heck are you going to end up buying this hardware? You're probably ordering it and having it shipped to you. GameStop is unlikely to have this on their shelves. Walmart, kind of unlikely to have them on the shelves. Target, any brick and mortar shop, I just don't think they're going to want to have the drum kits and the guitars on their shelves. They might have them on their shelves for like Black Friday through Christmas, but then they're probably going to try and clearance those out and put something else on the shelves instead. Yeah. It's probably not a bad start, though. Almost certainly, if you got the microphone, the guitar, the drum kit, any of those, yet another rhythm game will almost certainly support those inputs in the next year or so, unless there's just massive encryption locking them down, which I doubt it. So starting with Stage Tour bundled to get the hardware, which also gives you hardware that is new instead of going to a thrift shop where you very likely are going to find something broken, where the buttons are sticky and the strum bar just isn't correct. Yeah, this would be a good way to get back into that, and then move from Stage Tour to a more open source option when you want more music, and not fall into expansions and DLCs, which is almost certainly what you would expect would happen here, is that you're starting off with 90 official licensed tracks. That's not really that many songs compared to all the songs in the world. It's more than enough, I imagine, for most people who are just going to barely play the game. But yeah, if you want a really deep library, or if you want to play songs that are just lesser known, or you want to play covers of songs that are lesser known, you're not going to have that option in any kind of officially licensed game. Okay, moving on. Road Kings has been delayed to March 11th, 2027. I would assume that this is a driving simulator game of some sort. Yeah. Probably not something that would really interest me, so I will just move on. The Showa American Story Gamescom 2026 trailer and screenshots are available. This is a new game being announced. Kind of sounds almost like it's a parody of American Horror Story. It does seem very weird in its screenshots, and it is new to me, so I have no idea what's going on. Again, if I had more time, I would hit play on the trailer and watch it, but today is going to be a very long stream no matter what I do. So looking at the screenshot, it looks like we're talking about an alternative history where Japan and the United States somehow merged much more significantly in culture. One would leap to a logic there that the split would have been World War II happened, Pearl Harbor happened, and America surrendered. The Man from High Castle is a story where Hitler succeeded and took over most of the east coast of the United States, and they partnered up with Japan to take over most of the west coast. I imagine that's not going to have anything to do and not be anywhere close to what this game is about, and that this is probably just a crazy Japanese game that loves some parts of American culture and wanted to make a half Japanese, half American culture mix. It does look interesting, certainly. Steeped in retro pop culture. Dominant Japan culturally colonized America, resurrected from the game. From the grave, Chigusa Choco embarks on a road trip of combat exploration growth across a world both absurd and strangely familiar. Interesting. It almost feels like this is slightly inspired by something like Lollipop Chainsaw in its weirdness and Death Stranding in the travel experience. So yeah, interesting to say the least. But a lot of games do have a lot of intrigue when they're first shown, and then people don't actually play them, or when they do play them, they're very dissatisfied with the experience. A game like that very much may not play great, and many people may quit it early and not make it all the way through to enjoy the totality of the experience. I feel like that's a problem with like Deadly Premonition, and I don't think even the remaster of that game really fixed that, in that the controls and the experience of actually playing Deadly Premonition is not good enough to really want to play the game, versus watching someone else play Deadly Premonition for the story, which is a much easier experience. Moving on, Aliens Fireteam Elite for Switch 2 launches September 29th. It's out today for PS5, Xbox Series, and PC. It is surprising how many Aliens come out, Aliens games come out, and yet almost none of them are reviewed well. I think there is definitely a lack of care as far as whoever is licensing Aliens to game developers, but there probably is just also a lack of real chance of an Aliens games being good. Honestly, I don't even think a lot of the Aliens movies are that good. I think most people would probably say Alien, the first movie, Aliens with an S, the second movie, and maybe Alien 3 are the only good Aliens movies worth watching, and all the spin-offs and all of the others aren't. But even at that, that's 3 good Aliens games. I'm not sure you can even name, that's 3 good Aliens movies. I'm not sure if you can actually even name 3 good Aliens games. I'm gonna literally take this off the fall list since it is so low, and it's still in the top sellers, so sadly that really does go to point out that name recognition still does cause things to sell pretty well. There may be a problem with the premise of being a human in an Aliens game in the first place. You're just doomed to failure in that case. You almost certainly should be playing as the aliens, the xenomorphs, in an Aliens game. Yeah, and I think the best Aliens game was probably Predator versus Aliens in arcade back in the 90s. Moving on, Mugenics is coming to PS5, Xbox Series, and Switch 2 on September 8th. Not particularly surprising, considering that this is from the same maker of Binding of Isaac, and Binding of Isaac is all on those consoles, and I feel like Mugenics is probably less offensive than Binding of Isaac is. It did take a little bit of time for it to announce and come out, but the people who played it really liked it. There's still even a decent amount of people playing it 6 months later or so. It's rated very positively. It still does have that weird grotesque imagery that Binding of Isaac has, or similar weird grotesque imagery. Moving on, Petite Planet launches this winter. Apparently there's an update to this story. Signups for the final beta test, which began on September 22nd, are available via the official website. Yeah, you may have already even looked at that game on Steam. See, that's going to be part of the problem. If I start looking at articles and games before I start recording, I'm going to very quickly forget what I saw or said before I hit the record button versus after. I'm still debating about how I can reduce the amount of repetitive news articles. But yeah, starting with Gamatsu almost certainly is going to fix a lot of issues, because we'll talk about the vast majority of stories in a format I prefer the most. Paradox Interactive announces a post-apocalyptic survival grand strategy game, Afterworld, for PC. Emerge from the ruins into a new age. Interesting that sounds, just on the face of it, a lot like a Fallout game, which, slightly inspired by Fallout, is not a terrible way to start. The actual looks of the game seems to be much more of a strategy game. They're calling it a 4X strategy game, which probably means it's not real time and it's turn-based. I've never been a huge fan of 4X strategy games, but that's mostly because most of them are set in space, and space games I've never been a fan of. But yeah, I would have to be cautious about whether this game would be for me. But I don't have a release date yet, so there's very little I can do with it. Hitman World of Assassinations Elusive Target Mission The Herbalist, starring Snoop Dogg, launches August 27th. Snoop Dogg is getting pretty old, and I don't think he's particularly that healthy, so I wouldn't be surprised if he's not around for much longer. I guess I shouldn't curse people with baseless speculation. But yeah, that's about all I have really to say about that. We can say that Hitman World of Assassination is rated very positively and still has a decent amount of people playing it on Steam, which is saying probably quite a lot considering how that game is designed. How that game is designed in particular is problematic for me, who maybe would want to do some of the previous elusive targets and catch up and just play it like a regular single player game instead of like a almost mobile game where you have to consistently come back and do the elusive targets when they're available. Let's see, Aeon 2 has been delayed to October 5th worldwide, no longer coming out in September. Again, I would assume that is because they're avoiding GTA. Metro 2039 Renegade trailer and screenshots are available on Gamatsu, which, yeah, we're increasingly also seeing more age restriction things happening for YouTube as far as these game trailers. That is probably mostly to do with YouTube changing how it's doing things and censorship laws just around the world. But yeah, even a year ago, very rarely would you have to actually go to YouTube to play a age-restricted video. You would have to be signed in to YouTube, but they seem like they are straight up not allowing embedded age-restricted content anywhere now. YouTube is doing a lot of fairly weird stuff, which, yeah, some of that is to very much drive more views and drive people back to YouTube's main website and run up the numbers to make it look like YouTube is a lot more successful than it really is. Yeah, February 2027 isn't a really specific release date, however. Silver Palace has been confirmed for PS5. House of Greed multiplayer mode has been teased. I don't recognize a game called Silver Palace. It looks like a JRPG game, if I was to guess, of some sort. Yeah, that doesn't really say even that much if it has JRPG elements in it. And here we have very different visuals for this thumbnail versus this thumbnail. Yeah. An Arabian fantasy co-op action-adventure game called 1001 Threads of Mizan has been announced for modern consoles and PC. We are sitting on a list of 2 or 3 South Asian type games, inspired games or stories based on the cultures of Southwest Asians and South Asian people. The ones of these types of games that get made tend to be pretty small and under-reviewed because there really is just the beginning of a game development industry in those areas. Yeah. So yeah, this is exciting at a certain level, but it is also gonna take a while for it to come out, so I really can't get too excited by it. Warlock Dungeons & Dragons gameplay reveal trailer and screenshots are available on Gematsu. This is, I believe, a direct Dungeons & Dragons game. We've seen a teaser trailer for this in the past. Seems like it was 6 months to a year ago. Now we're actually seeing gameplay. Definitely feels like this game probably was rushed towards development. It may be a fine game, but we will have to wait until it comes out to know that. But almost certainly Baldur's Gate 3's success encouraged Wizards of the Coast to get a different studio to make a different Dungeons & Dragons game, which most people probably don't even know that Baldur's Gate is part of the Dungeons & Dragons experience. Although this is also a third-person action-adventure game in an open world, so it's seemingly going to play a lot closer to a Skyrim game, which is interesting competition, and I guess there's probably years before there's any chance of the next Skyrim game actually coming out, or the next Elder Scrolls game actually coming out. So yeah, this game Warlock could potentially eat Elder Scrolls lunch and be the new hotness as far as open world fantasy games go. Yeah, that would be intriguing. Although, if the gaming community really did embrace a Wizards of the Coast Dungeons & Dragons game, it's really going to embolden and give money to Wizards of Coast, who are really, really bad at being customer friendly. And honestly, I think Wizards of the Coast is maybe 1 or 2 steps worse than dealing with Bethesda and their parent company Microsoft. Yeah. So it's really just trading off one bad guy for another. But I imagine the gaming community won't really consider that too much, and if this gets good reviews, people will jump into it. Although there is always that question whether people even want something that's a little bit like a Skyrim game. particularly after playing Baldur's Gate 3 and the turn-based experience. They may find that that was enough for now, or that they preferred the turn-based experience. Moving on, the Valor Mortis story trailer is available on Gematsu. I think this is the game where it's like zombie French warriors. Yeah. Some kind of weirdness happening too. French revolutionaries or during the French Revolution against the French aristocrats. This is coming out October 13th, 2026. Exodus launches April 7th, 2027. It's a science fiction action adventure RPG game. Take a moment right now, though. It has been an hour and 26 minutes into this stream. I have not really done more than 4 minutes of warm-up at the front and talked maybe for another 10 minutes throughout the rest, as far as just putting out opinions and thoughts. This is, for me, already too much information. Too many games being announced. And we're not even done. So imagine just how much worse it is when you're watching this at a Jeff Keighley presentation. It's overwhelming. Can you really remember all the games we've talked about up until this point? I bet you can't. I bet you've forgotten quite a few. And it doesn't help the game industry really to have trailers and announcements and try to build hype, which I'm mostly anti-hype, but I mean, there should be education and information put out. It doesn't really help the game industry if that information and education just gets forgotten or doesn't even get mentioned in the first place, because they just need to show one more trailer so Jeff Keighley can get another up to $500,000, up to $1 million for showing a trailer. Moving on, Dust Origins debut trailer Kickstarter campaign has been launched. I wonder if we are going to start to see a few more Kickstarter campaigns happening as layoffs and publishers are less willing to invest in games. Game of Thrones War for Westeros gameplay trailer and screenshots are available on Gematsu. It is very late to the party to do anything Game of Thrones, particularly since I don't think people are like regaining a love for Game of Thrones in any way. If the Game of Thrones game book series, The Song of Ice and Fire, was finished, then I could see people coming back and saying, well, maybe I hated that last season of the show, but I still liked the last book. But the Song and Ice and Fire book is not finished. Then you also have a red flag here of this being tagged as a tower defense game, which it doesn't really look like a tower defense game. It looks like a real-time strategy game, which lots of real-time strategy games have towers. That doesn't make them tower defense games in my book. Let's see. Control Resonant Altered State trailer and screenshots are available. It still very much feels to me like Control Resonant is very much being designed to play differently and feel differently and probably have a different kind of story than the original Control. So it's going to be just, I'm pretty sure, a spin-off side game that people are probably going to feel weird about, and that it is just not going to feel like Control. The best case scenario is it actually plays better than the first Control, which could easily be done, and tells as good, if not slightly better, of a story than Control. And that might work fairly well. Although it also, then if this was a huge success and sold well, it's going to create a weird situation where you can't bring back the original female protagonist to the series without making it a co-op game, or select your director or select your protagonist option, which, yeah, that would work fine if there was a co-op, or you could select either the brother or the sister for the next Control game, assuming there is a next Control game. I wouldn't be surprised if actually Control Resonant unlocks an ability to play as the sister kind of quickly into the game, and it's just like a surprise they're holding back. The problem I would foresee there is that it definitely seems like this guy is swinging a hammer where she was shooting a gun. So I don't know how you can make a game where both of those mechanics work well. But yeah, you can see there is at the very least a cutscene or two she'll show up in. Let's put that on the follow list. I didn't really love Control as much as mainstream video game journalists did. It was a fine game, but there definitely were some fairly repetitive sections in which you were just attacking wave after wave of enemies, and I think a lot of that could have been left on the cutting room floor, the gun and movement stuff. Notoriously, there was a whole section in the game I never even found the path to, so I missed an entire section while playing Control. Yeah, I do like some of the memorable parts and missions, but I definitely could only see myself playing some kind of modded, abridged version of the game in which you really rushed through the memorable portions, and then maybe just have it on really easy mode to skip most of the boring stuff. Moving on, yeah, I mean, it's crazy to say Control 1 had boring stuff in it for all the wild stuff that wasn't boring, but there definitely were sections. Like, you literally only have one enemy type in the hiss. They maybe are slightly different, but there's like one weird boss battle for a couple of other boss battles, but mostly you're just fighting the hiss, which, yeah, for 60 hours, that's repetitive. Moving on, a multiplayer first-person shooter, PUBG Det.net. Although, is it DT or is it DD? Looking at the picture and looking down here, it's DD. So you can see how the one person who runs Gamatsu was rushing here and typed in the wrong letter, from probably misreading it from his own handwriting, because it's quite the typo on a QWERTY keyboard to go from T to D. So yeah, dead.net. Why does this game need to exist versus PUBG? I am not sure. Is this supposed to line up more for like horror experiences? Maybe, where they don't want PUBG to be a horror experience. Yeah, the subheadline says introducing a darker new setting for the PUBG franchise. So maybe this is where they're going to put the Teen Plus or M for Mature content. But I'm not sure if it plays any different than a regular PUBG. Maybe the regular PUBG has more survival aspects and building aspects, and they took that out. I'd have to investigate further, and honestly I don't care enough to investigate further. don't really care about PUBG, so I wouldn't really care about a spin-off to PUBG. Let's see, Mega Man Dual Override has its first trailer and screenshots, which it is interesting that they're going to once again try and make a Mega Man game. It'll be interesting to see how successful that is, both in its implementation and in just the formula in particular, because we really just don't have an idea if Mega Man games of the old school time will work for a modern audience. It's worth remembering that Capcom's latest success is Pragmata, a very different game, and they are using Pragmata to promote Mega Man Dual Override. But yeah, the two are very different experiences. And before Pragmata came out, there was some weird rumors that proved to be wrong, that Pragmata actually was a reboot in some weird way of Mega Man, which that wouldn't have really made any sense at all. Moving on, Tides of Annihilation Beneath the Veil story trailer and screenshots are available. I'd assume this is another JRPG. If I had more time, I probably should try and scale up these screenshots. There is a decent amount of dead space in between all of that, where there's very little dead space on the sides of the videos. I'm actually doing quite a lot here. These buttons typically are hovering over the images. A lot of changing of the custom style sheets of web pages using Violent Monkey scripts, which, yeah, CSS has really become quite a thing. It's quickly moving to be almost a programming language in itself instead of a markup styling formatting language with new features it's adding. I do have a problem certainly with when a game just has a new trailer but it doesn't have a release date. I have an instinct to potentially make another YouTube short on it, but for some of these games it definitely feels like they're going to have a trailer, then 3 or 4 weeks later they're going to have another trailer and another trailer, and it's going to become fairly repetitive before they even have a release date. Where ideally I'd like to make a YouTube short on a game when it first is seen by me, when it has a release date, and maybe when it comes out at most. But that, I don't really have a good system to ensure I only make 3 shorts. And it's not really a problem at the moment because I'm not making any of the shorts at all. I'm far too busy with far too many other projects and problems I have to deal with. Crimson Desert Enhanced Update is now available. Is it not called Crimson Desert Online, or is that a completely different game? I wouldn't be surprised if it actually has dropped the online support and been released as a single player experience. I kind of expected that to happen to more games over the past couple of decades, is that you'd have Elder Scrolls Online, for instance, find some way to become a single player game. And it really never seems to happen. I would potentially try to play something like World of Warcraft online if you could make it an abridged single player experience. But yeah, I may be a unique audience of one there. Moving on, Sea of Remnants adds an Xbox version and launches in early 2027. This is that weird art style game with pirates. Yep. Which even saying that doesn't uniquely describe just one game, I would say. Okay. Let's see it on Steam and see if we can show anything else off. So yeah, there's nothing really new on Sea of Remnants to say. So let's move on. I think we're actually very close to being done with the Gamatsu articles, and then I guess we'll probably wrap around and do the Video Games Chronicle articles next. Silent Hill Townfall's English voice cast has been announced. Jovan Apadio, Kezia Burrows, and Terrio Quinn. I don't recognize any of those people. See, Jovan Apadio is from the Third Party Problem. It Welcome to Derry, which I guess that's the TV series spin-off, and the Odyssey. Yeah, I haven't watched any of those. I'm actually very much falling into the past as far as old things I'm watching and not really watching a lot of new things. Kezia Burrows was in, I guess, Observation, another thing I haven't watched. And then Terrio Quinn, I did see a few episodes of Lost in the Walking Dead, the main Walking Dead. I don't think I watched any of the ones who live. So, yeah, I basically have to see pictures of these people to know what the voice actors look like, to even compare them to their voice, to then see pictures of what the characters in the video game look like to try and make comparisons in the future. Noticeably here, I can say this feels like a continued and growing problem, in that it is very much just stunt casting and hiring face actors that are, the actors are supposed to be good at being in front of the camera and showing their face for voice acting work, where there really should be more professional video game specialist voice actors, or just voice actors in particular, getting these jobs. And so much nowadays of what they call voice acting in video games, though, is actually facial capture anyways, and so it may not be 100% stunt casting, because they may actually need face actors to scan their face and put them in the video game. And voice actors may not emote as well as face actors. I say may. The reality, though, is I'm uncertain whether that may is accurate or not, because a lot of actors these days just don't face act at all. You get a lot of people with Botox, a lot of people with plastic surgery, and a lot of people who have maybe 4 to a dozen faces that they want to do in front of a camera for like photo poses, which is fine if you're a model and you just have 4 or 5 faces, but is not fine if you are trying to be a face actor. You should be willing to look ugly in a few frames of every scene as a face actor, and increasingly people are not willing to look ugly in a few frames, and so they have these awkward smiles that they just are always locking down or barely emoting at all. Yeah, it's a problem. And that's an interesting conversation certainly to have around Silent Hill Townfall. In the past I've said I just don't feel like this really is going to be a Silent Hill game. It feels like Konami is just willing to license the Silent Hill name to anybody just to make some cheap money, because Konami doesn't really care. But yeah, it doesn't make any sense to me to make anything Silent Hill that isn't very closely connected to Silent Hill 2. Yeah, I'd like to see a remake of Silent Hill 1, maybe a remake of Silent Hill 3, maybe a new Silent Hill 3 that takes the story in a different direction. But Silent Hill F didn't feel like a Silent Hill game. It felt like a Fatal Frame game. And Silent Hill Townfall maybe has some feelings of something that could be a Silent Hill game, but it just isn't going to really work being set in Ireland or Saint Amelia. Yeah. Inherently, what Konami is trying to say here is Silent Hill is now just an anthology series, which is crazy because the only horror anthology series that's ever really even been attempted in the past decade was a huge failure, with each release getting worse and worse sales. Alright, so now I'm going to jump around. Eventually I'll move how these tabs get opened. And we'll go through the Video Games Chronicle articles now, which we'll go through that fairly quickly. Unless this is just going to be a pain in the butt and jump around. And I would assume we'll have a decent amount of repetition of things we've already covered. So the GTA 6, quote, have been heartbreaking for our team, end quote, says Rockstar Games as it breaks its silence. They put out an announcement. I don't think the announcement says anything specifically about we've heard the message and we're going to release the game on disc. Instead, it is just, I think, a probably carefully worded statement to try to evoke sympathy, which it's really hard to think that Rockstar as a corporation is going to actually get sympathy. They have like an apology for everything having taken as long as it has, which was really fully in their hands. But I don't think that's the real complaint at the moment, is that GTA took too long. Yeah. They also are claiming that these leaks are far less consequential than the hot coffee scandal, which, I mean, is a weird comparison. It's probably true, considering how the hot coffee scandal was promoted by 24-hour news networks. CNN, I believe, was a big one there, and got talked about outside of the gaming sphere quite a bit, and even had real impacts on laws, or threats at least of laws. The ESRB would probably be a lot weaker, which would probably be a good thing if it weren't for the hot coffee scandal, which, if I recall correctly, you only could get the hot coffee scene if you modded the game, but the mod was using some content that was left on the disc that shouldn't have been left on the disc. I mean, it really was just a pixely, like, sex scene. Like, I don't think you'd really even call it hardcore. But also, that was in the mid-90s, I believe, that happened. But yeah, overall for the game industry, the hot coffee scandal had a lot of impact. It probably had relatively little impact on Rockstar and GTA overall. And this leak also potentially is going to have little impact. Okay, well, it seems like I may just have to jump back and forth. Game Freak has suggested that Pokemon Champions was built partly so it could change battles in future games. The Pokemon developer says Champions was made in part to preserve the classic rules. That's weird, because I think one of the major complaints about Pokemon Champions is it isn't really preserving a classic rule system. I think it is 3-on-3, where the classic Pokemon would be 6-on-6. Yeah. So this may very well be Game Freak just gaslighting people. And it is kind of interesting that Game Freak is now getting interviewed and talking about Pokemon Champions instead of talking about their non-Pokemon game that came out. And I guess that game came out and has already been forgotten about. Yeah. It was short. There is a slight hope that maybe it would get an update and maybe get a little bit of improvement, but it really feels like it is going to be quickly forgotten. It is still shocking Game Freak was even able to make a good looking game, even if it was short. So yeah, I don't know what Pokemon fans would really want to see as far as changes in the battle system, short of just making it full action turn-based instead of turn-based. That would be the step forward, is that they would try to make it so that attacks just had cooldowns and everybody was attacking at the same time. They've tried several things to change Pokemon in spin-off games, and none of them are particularly great. Even Pokemon TCG Pocket, which I play, is a weird change on Pokemon trading card game to make it shorter, and honestly it's not as good. Here's one of these stories where we're going to see the update before we see the original story. The quote here is, "We heard your feedback. Blood of Dawnwalker is getting a 60 frames per second mode after Backlash. The developer Rebel Wolves previously said all consoles would lack such a performance mode. So now they're going to shove something in there. But if they weren't planning on doing it, you can generally assume it is not going to be worked on particularly well. And honestly, if you are talking quality modes at 30 frames per second, your performance is already suffering. Although it is the case that lots of games have terrible performance until they are optimized at the last stage, one of the last stages of developing a game before releasing it. I heard an interesting fact that pigeons have somewhere, I think, between 240 frames to maybe even 600 frames per second vision. So if you stuck a pigeon in front of a movie, even a 60 frames per second movie, it's just going to look like a slideshow to them. Which, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of birds have really good eyesight compared to humans, considering they need it to survive and to eat. I still think everything should target 60 frames per second at 1080p, and then we should just make things cheaper past that point. I think that's a good point to be at. Maybe then in another 10 years we'll have some kind of upscaling to 4K from 1080p. And I don't even know if we really need to go from 60 frames to 120 frames, because I would personally prefer 60 frames very consistently over 120 frames, but then the 1% lows are much higher, which 1% lows are the 1% of frames that don't come in on time, are causing a juddering, stuttering experience. A director calls Ori, 3 rumors nonsense amid claims that Xbox is making a new game without him. Quote, "I just talked to people at Microsoft," claims the director of the first 2 Ori games. It would be really crazy to make the game without him. Yeah, I don't think the director is going to really negotiate for a ton of money. if this was true, that would be fairly weird. Yeah. I don't think we really have a lot of examples of somebody being out of the loop that they're out of the loop. Usually in the game industry, if you're out, you know you're out. And if they're going to make a game without you, they're going to tell you that. Yeah. We really don't have a lot of examples of developers for the first 2 games not working on the 3rd game without the instance of the developer director themselves saying they were uninterested and they handed over to somebody else. And even that has only happened a few times. Typically we do see directors, perhaps too much we see directors as the sole creators of video games, when more than likely it is much more of a team effort. But the game industry in particular, more than even directors of movies, is certainly built around the prestige of the people making them, or at least the director making them. So you really bend over backwards to not have a director leave. The Evil Within 2 is one of the few examples of a game where the director came out and said he was less involved with the development of that game, and he handed it over to a protege. And yeah, that game was fairly different, but I don't know if it was worse than the first game. Both had pretty big problems. Honestly, the Evil Within 2 probably is better than the Evil Within. At least it's a little bit more consistent. Here's the headline of the same story. GTA 6 leaks far less consequential than the hot coffee sex scandal, claims the former Rockstar developer. Notes that this is a former Rockstar developer, so their opinion is really just an opinion. And leaks are going, and I don't see a real reason to mention anything I may see on the leaks. I typically don't talk about what might happen in the game other than my own speculation on rare occasions as to what might happen. The real consequence, I think, is almost certainly going to be whether we see pre-sales, pre-orders getting canceled or not happening in the first place. And unless we can get even close to accurate pre-sales numbers, we won't really know if there's any real consequence to these leaks or not. I can guarantee you right now, though, that if Rockstar ever gets anybody involved in this leak in the court system, their lawyers are going to do a 180 on it being far less consequential, as a quote from this former Rockstar developer. And Rockstar's lawyers are going to say it was hugely consequential and caused them millions, if not billions of dollars in damages. Yeah. One of the things I've seen that was the most resounding responses to these leaks was someone saying that the leaks really reminded them that GTA 6 is not the second coming of Jesus, and it is just another GTA game, and there's just not really a reason to be hyped, and there's not really a reason to pay the $100 you seem to have to pay to get all of the content, or the $80 to get the base game, which is potentially missing content, let alone any other even more expensive versions of the game. Yeah. Again, from me skimming the message that Rockstar put out, they said, "We're sorry we were late to put this game out." They are definitely not saying anything about the fact that it's not coming out on discs, which the Microsoft Disk to Digital program, I think, has just launched, I don't think we have a news story for it, so we'll probably talk about it next Wednesday. And they definitely aren't talking about the fact that they are going forward as the flagship to spearhead video games, starting really at $80 instead of even pushing for 70, when really games should be 60 just to maintain the price. And really, if we were going to throw in the cost of living changes, when 60 was first introduced as a video game price, video games really should be closer to $50 or $40. They should be getting cheaper, not more expensive, even if they are getting bigger. And bigger, so it's more expensive, is just a concept that really needs to go away completely as far as video games are concerned. People don't have time or patience or even desire to play 200-hour games anymore. So make your game 60 at most and make it cheaper. Moving on, this is the story before. Blood of the Dawnwalker console footage confirms no 60 frames per second mode at launch. The update here saying it was added following backlash. It does very much seem to me like you may very well need need 60 frames per second for this game to look good, but it also is possibly the case that you just need 60 frames per second to appease people who are obsessed with frame rates, even if it doesn't really change the experience of the game. So Double Fine was one of the companies that Microsoft let buy their freedom back, and immediately I think they're going back to what they were doing before they were acquired by Microsoft. They've announced fans will be able to vote for its next game following its Xbox split. They're holding their first game jam since 2019. They're calling it Amnesia Fortnite 2026. Which, yeah, that to me seems like they really don't have good leadership who can tell which game is actually the game they should be working on, and they think they can do what they did many years ago, which is have a Kickstarter campaign and get a lot of money up front for what then gets delivered years later to be a mediocre point and click game in Broken Age. Yeah. But yeah, I suppose we probably should see stunts like this, and that's what I would call this, happen more often. Because there's plenty of companies that probably are desperate to try to figure out some way to fund their next game, and going for a public Kickstarter is one way to do it, although it's almost certainly one of the worst ways to do it compared to just keeping your game pitches private and pitching it to publishers. We may very well be in a situation where publishers just are not funding games at the moment, though. Previous prototypes from Amnesia Fortnites led to Costume Quest, which is a good enough kids RPG game series. They certainly could make a new Costume Quest. Space-based DF9, I don't even know what that is. And Headlander, I played that game. It was alright, but it wasn't great. And others inspired parts, such as a section in Psychonauts 2. Yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if this live stream game jam is really just going to be a hard sales pitch to get people to support them on things like Patreon and Kickstarter. And I've always had a dislike for game jam people who get too much in the game jams. It's probably a different situation for Double Fine, since you already have established people working at a company actually working on final products, but game jams can very easily invite people who can only work on games for a couple days and don't have the attention span or the stick-to-itiveness to actually make a final product that could actually be sold. If you look at most game jam games, they are incredibly short, and fairly simplistic, and fairly silly or dumb. There is just no real fruit on the vine from most game jam games, and because people who fall into doing game jam games constantly are just jumping around, it is just this ADD lifestyle in which you're getting that dopamine hit of people saying, oh, this is a good game, I liked it, but nobody is actually going to give you any money for it, and you wouldn't have a clue how to expand it into a proper game that would actually sell on Steam, which, let's face it, that's where all games need to sell. Let's see, and then we have another Video Games Chronicle article. Here's what's missing from the Duskblood's network test. Miyazaki promises extensive customization and story for the final game. I mean, for a network test, it's not crazy that there would be no story in it, and that you might even have the beginnings of story and then it would just have filler text or skip it completely. Customization might actually affect your network experience if there are different people in different kinds of clothing and that's supposed to load in and load out. But I could see where if you just need to get the network code working first and foremost, you might very well not have the customization set up and ready to go. We still have a few, actually still have quite a few Video Games Chronicle articles. Yeah, and this is again only from Friday to Wednesday. Next Wednesday is going to be from Thursday to Wednesday as far as video game news happens, so it's going to potentially be even longer, but maybe not, because, well, it's going to heavily rely on how much more gets announced at Gamescom. By the way, I paused the video. You probably saw when I paused it, and I didn't mention it until now, and looked up the price for getting all of the Stage Hero plastic musical instruments. Yeah, if you want the wireless microphone, which they're calling the Pro Kit, and the guitar and the drums, you are paying, I believe, $400, and you get the game, obviously. And it is separate versions for PlayStation 5, PC, Xbox, and Switch 2, and it looks like they're not going to have the drum set available for the Switch 2 at launch. So, yeah. That's a lot of money. $400 for a bunch of plastic instruments that are going to take up a lot of space. But it is also probably the easiest way and not that much more expensive than trying to find old Guitar Hero type instruments, which they say all the old ones will work too. Which, yeah, the old ones, if you do find them, would need to be in decent working shape. Moving on, CD Projekt Red clarifies the Witcher 3 remastered upgrade path for Switch 2 as pre-orders become available. Witcher 3 Wild Hunt Remaster will be a free upgrade even if you own a physical version of the game. I suppose Switch 2 maybe makes that a little bit more complicated. If you own the game digitally, you can now pre-order the remastered version for free on the Nintendo eShop. If you own a physical copy, don't worry. You'll be able to claim the You'll be able to claim the free upgrade when the remaster launches on September 29th. Yeah, and that is definitely not a great experience when you have to show more and hop over to X / formerly known as Twitter. We'll leave it at that. Apparently, the success of Uncharted 2's set pieces had a negative impact on Uncharted 3, the designer says. The need to add more set pieces in the third game ruined the story, he believes. Well, I mean, I guess as somebody who hasn't actually played any of those games, and it's actually fairly hard to play Uncharted 1 through 3, I, through osmosis, recognize the set pieces and notice the set pieces, but I really couldn't tell you much as far as what the actual story of those 3 games are, which isn't really surprising since I haven't played the game. So maybe it did ruin this story. This sounds like to me like it's mostly sour grapes. But it could be someone realizing far too late that they shouldn't listen to feedback even when it's positive feedback, because if they had an artistic vision that they wanted to do with Uncharted 3, they should have just done it and ignored any suggestion. Like, yeah, definitely I've seen these kinds of cutscenes as the big set pieces. And I'd assumed that a lot of sections of the game were more just running and gunning in more boring set pieces, and just the train was kind of unique. There actually might have been a lot of quick time events in the Uncharted series. Honestly though, I don't think that really ruined the game series. It could have, but if I was to guess, what probably ruined it was a lack of interest in Uncharted and Nathan Drake as a character, and a growing interest in doing The Last of Us, which the first Last of Us story was great. Maybe the first Last of Us didn't have any huge set pieces, so maybe they corrected for that. But yeah, the Uncharted series was pretty much dumped for focusing exclusively on The Last of Us, which then they tried to make a sequel to The Last of Us 2, and I think many people would argue that that took it in a direction that people are not interested in, or weren't happy with. Moving on, Heroes of Might and Magic 3 Remake was announced as the complete edition, releases on Steam with no game files. Heroes of Might and Magic 3 Complete Edition is available now on Steam after issues, and the remake is coming in 2026. Again, I'm still not sure why they would have released this complete edition when they had a 10-year-old remastered edition, which was better. It seemed like in every way, unless there is some maps or quests in the complete edition that's not in the remastered edition. It could be a good old games thing that that then is being ported over. Seems like that's exactly the case. Heroes of Might and Magic originally launched in 1999, actually very late 90s. Ubisoft launched the HD edition 6 years later in 2015. Is that 6 years? No, 16 years later. Yeah. The Steam release of the HD edition lacked the game's 2 expansions, and as such, most players recommended the complete edition Good Old Games release. So now I know the difference, which included all content and had an HD mod available. Now, Heroes of Might and Magic Complete is launched on Steam for £8.99 and includes both Armageddon's Blade and the Shadow of Death expansions, but players who bought the title found the game download did not actually include any game files. But yeah, Ubisoft, I think, is really screwing the pooch here in that whole experience. What a terrible way to treat what would have been one of the best-selling games of 1999. Probably Game of the Year for 1999, if not 2002. And certainly Heroes of Might and Magic 3 from 1999 also highlights how much strategy games played a role for PC gaming in the old days, before controllers really became standardized and first-person shooting became the default for everything. So, more Ubisoft news, which obviously should be taken with a huge pinch of salt. Ubisoft has announced a Rainbow Six Tactics. I guess it's just called Rainbow Six Tactics. It's a single-player turn-based game coming to consoles and PC. Which that feels very different from anything else called Rainbow Six to me. Again, I suspect Ubisoft is desperate to make any money it can. Geralt of Rivia makes his debut in Diablo 4 as The Witcher 3 Remaster launches on Battle.net. It is very weird to see anything launching on Battle.net. Is this the new Microsoft Play that we're just going to see Microsoft games, which CD Projekt Red's Witcher 3 is not a Microsoft game, put into Battle.net? I mean, if that was the plan from day one, I'd almost applaud it for the gall to say, hey, the Windows launcher for games, the Windows Store, or the Microsoft Xbox Games launcher, is just going to be Battle.net. I think you would almost certainly call it the Xbox Games launcher still, though, and not keep Battle.net as the name. But the story here is even weirder than that, because you have a third-party game coming to Battle.net, which, to the best of my knowledge, there are no other third-party games on Battle.net, and it seems like it would be very weird for that to become a new thing happening. As we look at Blizzard's listings, I guess Blizzard's listings end here, and this is all CD Projekt Red stuff, kind of. This might be The Witcher 4. This is Cyberpunk 2077. This is Cyberpunk Edgerunners, which is a Netflix anime, which is really just a licensed product. Blizzard is showing Overwatch, Overwatch 2, World of Warcraft, I assume, Diablo, and I guess they're throwing a bone to StarCraft in some level, although they haven't really done anything new with StarCraft in a while. Maybe this is a hint at a bigger merger, in that maybe CD Projekt Red is going to buy Blizzard. I would think it would be fairly weird if Blizzard bought CD Projekt Red, though. But yeah, it definitely seems strange. And it's pretty weird to have Geralt of Rivia in Diablo 4. If Diablo 4 was just like Diablo 1 and 2, I would find that a lot more exciting. but the fact that your characters reset after a season in Diablo 4 really makes it a game I would just never play. The Asus ROG Xbox Ally X20 OLED pre-orders have opened up starting at $1,299.99. There hasn't really been a lot of enthusiasm around any of the ROG Xbox Ally versions. The Steam versions of ROGs also haven't gotten a lot of enthusiasm either. A lot of these handheld things were overpriced before the Steam Deck came out, and they still are overpriced now. And yeah, they might be slightly more powerful, but slightly more powerful potentially doesn't get you much. Like, theoretically, we have the Steam machine saying it's 6 times more powerful than the Steam Deck OLED in particular. I assume that was the comparison they were making. And for the most part, it still is being ridiculed as being too expensive and not powerful enough as a piece of hardware. Yeah. I imagine even amongst Steam Deck fans and handheld fans, you're going to see little coverage of this and little enthusiasm of this, as it is just really going to be too expensive. Particularly if we read the subheadline saying the system's internal specs are the same as the 2025 Xbox Ally X model. Yeah, so nothing has even been improved, and the price goes up. We probably will see a lot of that where things get new names at a higher price, just so it hides the fact that they're raising the price due to part shortages or just general greed. Genshin Impact creator Hoyo Voice announces a realistic new Monster Hunter-like game called Notice Fall. It is a co-op RPG inspired by Monster Hunter. Okay. Interesting, but we don't really know too much there until we get much more details and it actually comes out. This is another Game Awards world premiere trailer from Gamescom. Yeah, the Game Awards YouTube channel is just going to have all of those trailers. And that is the better way to watch it. If you absolutely must see all the trailers, you can just subscribe to the Game Awards YouTube channel and they will very quickly flood your YouTube feed with all the trailers. You can skip all the introductions in between and save yourself several minutes. Also, you can pick and choose trailers, which will save you even more time. Moving on, James Turner, which was apparently the first Westerner to design a Pokemon, has rejoined the franchise. Turner left Game Freak in 2022. It is certainly weird to leave a job and then come back 4 years later. Which, yeah. I don't know what to really take from that. And I don't know if you really can take anything from it. He probably created all of these Pokemon here. I cannot name a single one of these Pokemon. But in fairness, I wouldn't be able to name any of the newer generation of Pokemon after maybe the 3rd or 4th generation of Pokemon. It might imply Game Freak doesn't care that much about Pokemon as a franchise. Almost certainly the truth. But it might also be that his designs are just better than what other people are offering. I really don't believe Pokemon is benefited by having another 100 Pokemon be created. or 100 evolutions of existing Pokemon being created. I think it is better suited to cull the numbers. Really, what they should have the Pokemon do is merge together, kind of like how some of the Digimon happened in their cartoon series, is that you would just have two Pokemon merged together to make one stronger version of a Pokemon. You could, I think, do that fairly well, and I don't know exactly how you would depict it. Maybe just set the Pokemon games in the past where there's less Pokemon, or in the future where there's some kind of disaster and there's less Pokemon. Honestly, you could set Pokemon in a sci-fi future where most Pokemon have left the planet Earth, and then you could have a much smaller selection that way too. Let's see. Moving on, the United Kingdom comic Bob Mortimer stars in Murals, the next game from Battletoads and Disney Illusion Island developer Dlala Studios. So, I do know Bob Mortimer. I don't know if he's really done a lot of voice acting. The Battletoads reboot I don't think was received particularly well, and I feel like Disney Illusion Island was one of those mobile games that wasn't even that well advertised. Yeah. He's a funny enough guy for the things I've seen him in. He, of course, has a British style of comedy, but none of that really has to play any role at all in the actual game, because he very possibly is just going to be given lines to speak and will read them. His voice is kind of unique. It's a British old man's voice, and I don't think he can do other kinds of voices, so I feel like that only makes sense if he is playing something close to a British old man. It's an odd choice, and almost certainly a case where there is stunt casting going on. I think it would probably be a little dangerous to hire British actors to voice act in video games, because there's just a tradition of only working on things for one series, which often a series on TV shows is 6 episodes, maybe a dozen episodes, and then they move on to something completely different and often never come back to do another series. So yeah, the British are not really known for being tied into contracts and doing season after season like the actors in the United States TV shows are. And I wouldn't be surprised if video game voice acting has that same situation. So if a game goes well and you want to make a sequel, you may very well find that Bob Mortimer is not interested, or more accurately, his agent may just not be interested. Moving on, Discord has denied being served subpoenas by Take-Two as GTA 6 leak crackdown sweep the internet. Discord says it will evaluate the validity and scope of the GTA crackdown. Now, I don't think there's any legal reason why you can't lie and deny being served subpoenas, and certainly you could lie and say that maybe the subpoenas are not from Take-Two specifically, but are actually from a court district, or from even Microsoft. I know for some reason Microsoft is also trying to take down some of these leaks. They very possibly are not getting subpoenaed, which would be forcing them to ask questions, as much as they may just be getting DMCA takedowns. which, yeah, are very much a different thing. This feels like a canary in the coal mine type statement where they're saying Discord has not yet been served a subpoena from Take-Two. Which maybe not Discord, but maybe somebody else. And honestly, a subpoena could go to a lawyer's office and take a while before even the person running Discord knows it. Moving on, Call of Duty's Modern Warfare 4's Captain Price is going to receive a new haircut after the internet mocks his beta look. That ain't Captain Price, that's Lieutenant Cost, wrote one fan. Okay, that's a little funny, but not a great joke. Because you're making people have to think of this made-up character, Lieutenant Cost, and you're making the reference here that a captain is above a lieutenant, but you're not even going extreme there. Yeah, it would be better to make a more obscure reference like yeah, I want to say Pigpen from the Peanuts comic. But yeah, that looks like a pretty bad haircut. Again, this might very well have to do with like visual optimization more than anything else. I guess this was what he looked like before, and they're trying to make him look older now. This might be a good example also why we don't have a lot of curly hair and hair from people that are of other ancestry other than just your standard straight black white hair white people, black hair white people, that the video game hair engines have not been optimized and designed to show curly hair. Yeah, I'd probably, if I was trying to make a joke here, after thinking about it, I'd call it, that's not Captain Price, that's Crackhead McGee, or something like that. And McGee just being a made-up name, or Crackhead Price would be probably better, because then you're not just throwing in a random name. And in that version of the joke, you're only changing one word instead of two. Yeah, you're overcomplicating it by changing two. I'm wasting time here evaluating a joke written on the internet, though. So let's move on. Sony's latest PS5 advert revives exclusivity language following a report that it's ditching PC ports. The new ad proclaims Wolverine, Yeti, and Astrobot are only on PS5. Which, yeah, it definitely seems like we are hitting a point here where there was going to be a brief section in which PlayStation games were available on PC, and then they're going to stop being available on PC. Which is fairly dangerous because even PS4 and PS5 emulation is somewhat doable these days. It's not super easy, but it's somewhat doable, and you are only going to encourage the emulators to work harder on getting PS5 emulation going. Meanwhile, the vast majority of gamers are not going to bother to try to emulate PS5 games. They're just not going to buy them. And there really isn't a terrible time. Now is kind of the best time to boycott Sony for many reasons and not play any of these new games. You may have to play Wolverine years from now, and you may just miss out on things that you may not really even care too much about. Yeah, I don't know why I'm saying you would have to play Wolverine even. Like, Wolverine probably isn't going to be that good of a game. I have no idea what Soros is going to be. Gran Turismo is going to be very skippable for many players. Ghost of Yoti is going to be fairly skippable. Notice that this says or instead of. These people are really bad at writing for being mainstream video game journalists. And just using spell check and grammar checks. Although in fairness, Ghost or Yoti might pass a grammar check. And I could see a lot of people just not being super enthralled with God of War Luffy. Marvel token devs admit it will be extremely challenging to regain players' trust after a troubled PC launch. Marvel token producer tells Video Game Chronicle the team is working urgently to fix the PC issues. It is still the case that we have some Japanese developers that really don't see the value in PC gaming and optimizing for PC gaming on day one. And they think of it as more of a dumping space where they can just put out a version and hope it works. In fairness, I would say you probably have really consistent computer builds in Japan. I wouldn't be surprised if there's only 2 or 3 companies that make PCs in Japan and they all run fairly similarly, and it is very hard to test all kinds of different hardware. But yeah, this definitely feels like one of those cases where they should have delayed the PC release and not put it out in a bad shape. But it is at least nice to see Japanese companies at least getting it, whereas other companies often would at least pretend like they're not getting the complaints and say everything is okay or everything's going well and just try to gaslight people even when things go bad. You have a lot of Western companies that just refuse to admit fault. Rockstar might be a prime example of that. Moving on, Hideki Kamiya's Clovers has hired the composers behind Bayonetta and Okami. Clover's newly announced audio team is full of Platinum Games veterans. It definitely seems like we probably are just going to see a lot of people from Platinum Games moving over due to loyalty or just due to the realization that Platinum Games at the moment is not doing particularly well. Of course, Clovers doesn't own Bayonetta, and I don't think they own Okami either, so they're going to make something completely new, which is fine. We are still just waiting to see when they actually will have a teaser trailer to announce something. Oh, they are making a sequel to Okami, so I guess they do have a rights to that. Yeah. Yeah. Apparently, in various interviews, the Bayonetta series would have consisted of a total of 9 episodes, and that he wanted to grow the franchise as the Bayonetta saga, but it seems like I may have to take the full saga to the grave with me, was a quote in 2023. yeah, it's not like I own the Bayonetta IP. So yeah, Bayonetta is pretty much dead. But let me propose this thought. Hideki Kamiya pretty much only worked on Bayonetta 1 and 2. That would mean that there are probably 7 more ideas that didn't include Bayonetta 3 in his mind. He could make a different series that was a lot like Bayonetta, and I think people would be happy about that. Now, 7 sounds crazy. Frankly, I think any series of video games should have a first game and a sequel, and then you should take a 10-year hiatus before you even think about making a third game nowadays. But yeah, that would just mean he's got 3 Bayonetta-like games. You could certainly do a lot with that. Change things up, have different protagonists, different fight styles, different mythos happening. I just heard that there's a manga. I don't think there's an anime of it yet, but maybe there will be soon. That is a spin-off of the Bleach anime called Burn the Witch, where it's a Western soul society set in the Western world instead of a Asian Eastern soul society that you see in Bleach. And that's intriguing, certainly, quite a bit, to have a spin-off and have something similar to Bleach, now that Bleach is on the verge of ending, but still is fairly different. Let's see. Let's move on. Clutch lands new publishing deal. Clutch the game lands a new publishing deal with Focus Entertainment due out spring 2027. This is the debut racer from Maverick Games. It was originally set to be published by Amazon, which, you know, Amazon feels like it is pulling out of the video game industry after failing to really do anything successful in it. Man, we still have a couple of Video Games Chronicle articles. This is taking a while. And I never thought for a second that one of the problems of recording live to tape would be that a week-long worth of news would require me to start streaming at potentially 8 in the morning just to make sure the video is done recording by 5 in the evening. But yeah, it does feel like that very much might turn out to be how it has to be done. And then an entire day is just going to be spent making the recording, which is fine because that's still one whole day instead of 2/3 to most of the day being spent on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 3 days a week. Moving on, CD Projekt sets The Witcher 4 release target as it provides a rare development update. The Witcher 4 will be worth the wait, says CD Projekt Red. It is very weird, certainly, for them to announce a remaster for Witcher 3 and talk about Witcher 4 in the same presentation. It feels like you would have been better if you had to go back and make a remaster of Witcher 3 to get people on board, to let that happen, let that come out, make sure it actually does evoke positive emotions to the Witcher series, and then make an announcement at the next presentation for The Witcher 4. Because it doesn't even seem like they really have much to say about The Witcher 4 right now, so they could have just said nothing. It would have been fairly acceptable to say, unfortunately, we don't have anything new to say about The Witcher 4 right now, but we do have this remaster of Witcher 3 free for everybody, so go out and play the whole game again. Hideo Kojima celebrated his 63rd birthday with a pledge to keep making games. 2026 marks Kojima's 40th year in the video game industry, which is to say he has been working in the video game industry since he was 23 years old, and knowing the Japanese, he probably was working a job before that when he was 14 or 15 even. It is not uncommon for Japanese high schoolers and even middle schoolers to get small part-time jobs, often jobs for just a few hours or just a day, to get a little bit of spending money. But yeah, while it is nice to say for him to say he's going to keep making video games, which I find questionable because it definitely felt like he had a real desire to get into making movies and befriend a lot more Hollywood actors. I think that probably is not worked out as well as he had hoped. But yeah, it definitely felt like he was going to go Hollywood. Yeah, I guess I want him to still make video games, but also his video games are weird and he doesn't make that many of them too. So I imagine he's going to make another Death Stranding game before he retires. Very possibly he's going to make a horror game. I think he's got one in the works there. And then maybe 2 more games. But he's kind of slow as far as how he makes games too, so there's weirdness there. You can also tell he's back in Japan for this birthday, because you're not going to get this intrinsic icing writing in Japanese likely outside of Japan. And yeah, you're not going to get a cake covered in fruit in most places outside of Japan as a standard way. Okay, let's go through the Gaming on Linux articles now. These probably going to have less to do with Gamescom and new game announcements. Of course, with Gamescom, I really have no clue what an average week would be. And we are, once again, I think, jumping around randomly. And, alright. We'll just see what we've got here. If we see a Steam game, we'll apply it while we're looking at it. Rayman Legends Retold. Looks interesting. It's coming out October 1st. So I'll put that on the follow list. And yeah. Drop Loot is a slick reinvention of Tetris as engrossing as a dungeon crawler. I'm questioning whether these kinds of game review, Gaming on Linux articles matter as much. Here's Drop Loot, it's not out yet. Here's Pony Island 2, which was one of the games teased. In fact, we may run into a decent amount of things that we've already talked about. Here we have a game called Loft Song, which also I assume is something that's new. Looks like a puzzle game. That's about all I can say about it. Excuse me. We've got Dust Origins. Again, no release date. Looks like it's a top-down shooter. The Steam Machine and Steam Controller support is coming to NVIDIA GeForce Now, plus DLSS 4.5 Ray reconstruction is out for desktop gamers. which I assume that is DLSS 4.5 for GeForce Now, but maybe not. But yeah, it's been a long time since I've even bothered to update my NVIDIA drivers. Of course, I also have a whole computer that I'm failing to put together. Probably have been trying for months to actually put it together. Yeah, upscaling technology doesn't really interest me that much, and streaming GeForce Now has only a minor interest in that. It seems like you probably can do some of that with a Steam Deck and a handheld, where it would kind of make sense. I still feel like for a Steam machine, the games probably should play on the Steam machine, or at worst, it is streaming from another gaming PC within your own house, not streaming from servers like GeForce Now. Which, yeah, inside your house, you would just assume latency would be minimal. A true classic Super NES JRPG called Terranigma is coming to PC in early 2027. It is interesting how we are seeing some of these old school Japanese games that may not even have been released in the West. But also you run into the problem that they are old school JRPG games, and you may very well not have any nostalgia for them, and even if you do have nostalgia for them, they may not be that good. This definitely feels like this may have originally released on something like a Neo Geo, something with a 4:3 ratio screen. But didn't it say Super NES? Well, that would have been 4:3 screens too. I guess I'm going to make an exception and put this on the follow list, but only because I'm interested in seeing if it gets anybody's attention, really. In the sense that a lot of these games come out on Steam and nobody really buys them or reviews them, because while they may be historically relevant, they really aren't relevant to modern gamers. W4 Games, the company that was formed by Godot Engine veterans, gets help and funding from Tencent. They've been given an extra $18 million to continue to expand their enterprise technology and support for the open source Godot engine. This new round of funding that was just announced was led by Tencent with support of other investors including OSS Capital, LUX, Naval, Ravikant, and Tobias Lutke's family office. I have no idea who any of those are other than Tencent. I assume they're probably angel investors. They've signed a multi-year strategic partnership with Tencent to help them scale up the business and Godot ecosystem across Asia, and to help the likes of marketing, localization, ecosystem support, advocacy, and so on. So basically this is all about getting more people to make games with the open source Godot engine, particularly getting Chinese developers to use the Godot engine, which Godot really is going to have to improve its encryption very quickly, because you're going to find a lot of Chinese game developers making games in the Godot engine, and then very quickly people stealing the games because the encryption and obfuscation is fairly weak by default in Godot. It's non-existent by default in Godot. And yeah, if you're making an open source game, that's fine, but I think a lot of people want to actually make some money off these games. I wouldn't be surprised if we see in the next 10 years a complete swap in popularity, where anything that was using the Unity, most mobile games, anything using the Unity engine is going to move to Godot. The question still, and this is the big question for Godot, is when are we going to see the first hyper-realistic game, the first person shooter game made in the Godot engine that is really successful? Because most of the projects, most of the tutorials, most of the examples you see with the Godot engine is making things that are dangerously close to looking like RPG Maker games. You're making pixely 8x8 sprites, 16x16 pixel sprites, 64x64 sprites. That probably is the reality of the size, but yeah, you're making things that look a lot like Super NES games. You're not seeing a lot of examples of them using their fairly powerful physics engine to make 3D games, because those take longer, and so it hasn't been long enough for us to see any examples of that. But it will happen one day. At least once it'll happen. The cult classic horror point-and-click adventure Sanitarium has returned as Sanitarium Enhanced. Again, I wonder if this might have been a Good Old Games Preservation Program release, but I don't see any example of that. For a second there, I thought this was a cult horror game for the GameCube, which I believe might be called Sanitarium Requiem or something. But I could be thinking it could really have a completely different name. But I looked at it, and it definitely is not. This feels like a game that would have caught my attention had I seen it when it came out, but I didn't see it. It is interesting to have a horror point-and-click adventure game, but not that weird. So this feels like this could be right up my alley, and I do love covering old games, so I'll put that on the follow list. Bazlight 44 gets a hotfix for various issues after a recent big release. There's a list here of what they're fixing. This is probably a great example of why you don't want to always have the newest version of things, particularly Linux builds. You might wait a week and you will do a little bit better just to make sure all the bugs are fixed. These open source developers often don't have a lot of people or a lot of money to test everything out, and even if you do test to your best ability, there is just a wide difference between testing Bazlight 44 on 1,000 different PCs versus testing Bazlight 44 on 1,000,000 different PCs. Once you actually release it out in the wild. And frankly, it is just really easy to make mistakes in programming. Frankly, it's impossible to not make mistakes in programming. There was a bug in the Linux kernel where it was literally just rounding the number up when it needed to round the number down, and it was part of like a video driver code, and so it was just locking up the system and crashing the computer because of a simple mathematical mistake, which, yeah, very easy to do that, as you might have one video card that expects a number to be rounded down, and you might have another video card that expects the exact same number to be rounded up or rolled over even. Which, yeah, rolling over numbers is not generally accepted in programming is a good thing. Let's see. Valve updated a bunch of their old Steam shooters. This is, I guess, the only thing they did publicly for their 30th anniversary, which was, I believe, yesterday. Which, I mean, what could they really have said on their 30th anniversary? They could have put out the Steam Frame VR at a super high price. and nobody would have liked it. They could have announced Half-Life 3 was available and ready to play now, which is a fantasy and would never really happen. They could have put out the games they actually are working on out on the 30th anniversary, but I don't think those games are ready either, and I think probably there's only one game that's even close to being ready. So yeah, they could have done a little speech, but they probably are best to just say nothing. I saw a arrangement of different pictures of Gabe Newell, and over the past 5 years he's done fairly well, probably because of improvements in medicine to lose weight and look a lot healthier. He's also been working with his health company, so I wouldn't be surprised if there's something there, but I would say this year his age is probably starting to settle in too, and yeah, he is certainly old enough to retire / expire. But yeah, also Gabe Newell is pretty much just a figurehead, and not even the figurehead that Valve puts out to make announcements. It is, I guess, a little surprising that the two annoying young kids, I say kids, they're probably in their 40s themselves, didn't show up for the 30th anniversary. And I don't think there was any like free giveaways from the Steam store, the point shop, for the 30th anniversary. Honestly, I don't think they even gave away any games. I bet a big reason is because it is the 30th anniversary, come to think about it, because if they gave away Half-Life 1 on their 30th anniversary, a lot of people would just assume that's a secret hint to Half-Life 3. The games they did fix are incredibly old games. But this is basically not news at all at that rate. The Alien Breed 35th Anniversary Collection has been announced for September. I vaguely recall a game called Alien Breed. I probably played it for like an hour at most. You would get a lot of these like demos of games on CD-ROMs, or maybe even the full game, but it just wouldn't really run well or be my interest. Yeah, this is 35 years ago that this game would have come out, and this definitely wouldn't have been the type of game I would have really wanted to play. But yeah, I think it probably has some small historical relevancy. Again, we'll have to wait and see if people actually remember this game or want to play it in modern times. That probably highlights a category of games that are just so old and so irrelevant that it's not even worth trying to remaster that or reboot it as a series. The only thing you can do is put it out on Steam and hope you get a few dollars off of it. Which, yeah, I think we're going to run into similar situations with a lot of streaming TV and movies too. Is that you're just going to see really old shows put out on some streaming service with ads, and that's the best you're ever going to get for those shows. Moving on, DW Proton 11.0-12 has been released to fix Wuthering Waves on SteamOS and Linux. It seems to be the only patch. DW Proton is, I think, a different version of Proton than what you would have on a Steam machine or a Steam Deck, though, so you may not need it. Wuthering Waves, we can see, is very popular as I think it mostly is a mobile game with in-app purchases, but it looks certainly pretty enough to be played on a PC. You can get a bunch of co-op games and Lovecraftian adventures in 2 fresh Humble Bundles. I went, when I was curating these articles, out of my way to try and close all of the tabs. That is, I think, a time saver that I will work with in the future too, is because I just don't think it's really worth it to open Steam links to all these old games. A lot of these games are rated very positively, but you can see Gaming on Linux even does you the favor of telling you that without actually having to click to the pages. These two bundles also are not ones I really would want to get, but might be a cheap way to get Call of Cthulhu. Yeah. There was a time there where I thought the Lovecraftian Cthulhu games were a lot more popular than I think they ever really were. That very well may have been a case of Giant Bomb leading me astray in my thinking patterns. Ancient Dragons has added Steam frame support. Not Ancient Dragons, Ancient Dungeons, if I can read things correctly. You can see that this is a VR game and it's overwhelmingly positive. Definitely feels somewhat like Minecraft in its voxel blockiness, but actually looks a lot more like a traditional dungeon crawler than Minecraft. We have a game called Storebound, which is out now in 1.0 version. I'll look at this later when I actually do a proper follow list cleanup. I'm actually running out of time. Yeah. I need to hurry to some stopping point. I'm not sure exactly where the stopping point will be. Volt-GUI is an AMD Adrenalin / NVIDIA settings alternative for Linux. I assume that means it's a graphical user interface to adjust the settings, internal settings for GPUs. Stuff that you very possibly should never touch or mess with, particularly if you don't know what you're doing. And even if you do know what you're doing, you're using an open source alternative software to do it, so you have to put a lot of faith in the programming to actually do the right thing in a safe way. My general suggestion is just leave things as they are, and it should work as good as you can expect it to work, and consistently. Overclocking, underclocking, all of that is really just a path of wasting a lot of energy in most cases, unless you just want to overclock something to the point of breaking it and to being wasteful, which that would be not suggestible in today's economy. But yeah, I guess if you had a 20-year-old video card, you might try and overclock it, but even if you did overclock it, your performance versus the amount of power you're using still probably isn't that good. Yeah, a lot of my old computer stuff is probably at that point where it's not worth even plugging in and turning it on, because it would use so much power to accomplish so little. Moving on, DirectX Vulkan Sarek 1.13.0 is a big release for older GPUs to play modern games on Linux. On the other hand, I guess you can be a Linux fan and use your old GPUs to do something. You can use it with Proton Cache OS or on any Linux distribution which includes it directly. Linux definitely is full of programmers who love to use really old hardware. How to Fish is another brilliantly funny online co-op game, whereas I've taken to calling them friend slop games. we can see that this one is rated very positively, and Gaming on Linux is recommending it. It is obviously very focused on online co-op type experiences. Paradox Interactive is going to publish a survival crafting creature collector adventure called Guardians of the Wild Sky. Which it is interesting that we have games being talked about here that were not talked about around Gamescom, from my other news sources at least. A mushroom munching dungeon crawler deck builder called Shroom and Gloom arrives September 10th. Whoops. You can see that this game is still waiting to come out. The 1992 Amiga shoot 'em up classic remake Apidia Special arrives August 25th, which I think in that game you're actually playing as the bee. It's already on my fall list. Tales of Iron 2 Whiskers in Water is from 2025. It brings in a game crossovers within a free expansion. It's a new crossover armor sets inspired by player favorites such as the Penitent one from Blasphemous, the Lamb from Cult of the Lamb, Dave from David the Diver, Crow from Death's Door, Will from Moonlighter, Boom from Beyond Galaxyland. I'm not familiar with most of those characters. It does feel like a lot of fairly indie filling games. Maybe they aren't actually indie games, but they feel like they're indie games. Here we can see Metro 2033 just has this February 2027 release date. WINE, which is a backronym. No, I think it's not even a backronym, but it stands for Wine is Not an Emulator. 11.16 brings more ARM64 support improvements. What it is the translation layer. It takes Windows function calls from programs and converts them into Linux function calls, because any window program, game or otherwise, is calling on libraries and function calls through an API that Microsoft created. So what Wine tries to do is just translate that directly and let Windows apps and games run, and it does that very well. Now what they're trying to do is slightly more complicated, because they're translating the function calls for Linux that would run on an AMD 64 instruction set, which is a normal computer, to now run on an ARM 64 instruction set, which is much closer to a cell phone reduced instruction set, which requires reprogramming everything all over again, basically, which most of that work has been started, and so they make continuing improvements. The long of it, or the short of it, is going to be, at some point, a lot of Windows programs are going to be running on very power efficient handheld type devices, mobile type devices, or very power efficient desktop type devices running ARM64 instruction sets instead of AMD 64 instruction sets. Here's Final Fantasy Revelation. We don't have a release date for that yet. And then onto those, I think we also already looked at. Alright, so then that is going to bring us to GameDeveloper.com articles. There's a report that Among Us 3D code developer Shell Games has laid off staff. Some of these stories we may have already talked about, and we are just going to cover the headlines. I really have only about 45 minutes, and I need more buffer. Riot Games is winding down 2XKO active development in December. That's slightly older news. The Journey maker That Game company announces that game publishers profit from Sky Children of Light will support the initiative. I'm surprised Sky Children of Light actually has profit. An Irish browser game startup called Entity raises $5 million in funding for console quality games for a new web era. The next generation gaming platform will launch in 2027. I am very amazed with what HTML, JavaScript, and CSS can do these days to make web pages, but I do not think for a second they are anywhere close to being a new platform for proper games. What you would see at best is HTML code that just embeds a plugin, which is exactly how you would have done online games in the old days. It would have been a plugin to run Java, or a plugin to play real games or real media before Java. But yeah, web pages are just not designed really to run games, and I don't think we're anywhere close to that. Web pages in general just don't even have controller support set up for them. So if I picked up my controller and started moving it around on a web page, nothing is going to happen by default. In fact, I think it'd be fairly hard to even get controller inputs through programming. W4 Games raised $18 million to expand its international team. We talked about this story before. Mostly of that money coming from Tencent. Yeah, we certainly have been concerned and cautious about Tencent's expansion into gaming worldwide, but yeah, we really haven't had that many examples of them doing something awful. I think Tencent may have ruined Daedalic as a company and created that awful Golem game. That's the only negative story I can really even think of. Next headline says each event has to feel local and relevant to its market. Gamescom wants responsible expansion after a record-breaking year. Yeah, Gamescom is definitely thinking about having more Gamescoms around the world, where the main Gamescom is in Germany, Gamescom Latin is in Sao Paulo, Gamescom Asia x Thailand game show is in Bangkok. Yeah, Gamescom definitely trying to be the new E3, but also probably doing it a lot better by having several events throughout the year and several locations for different audiences. Definitely still feels like Gamescom is more focused on letting actual gamers show up to these events. I don't know why gamers want to go to these events a lot of times instead of E3, which started off very much as an industry only event and really got awful when it started letting people in. Most of these events don't really have anything to show you anyway, so unless you're there to meet people and have fun with friends, it is generally a waste of money and time to go to those kinds of events. It's generally a waste of money and time to do most events. The creative artist agency spins up an indie funding venture called Frame One Games. Quote, we want to support emerging, often under-resourced teams that don't need to have the financing relationships or marketing resources that the others do. Makers Fund expands the game industry footprint through $250 million investment. $250 million investment. There's a report that Take-Two subpoenas Microsoft and Discord in a bid to halt extensive GTA 6 leaks. Of course, Discord has since denied that they've been subpoenaed. Although I don't know why you would subpoena somebody to halt leaks. Now that just feels like that is the wrong phrase to use. Wouldn't it be you petition them to halt the leaks, or you send them a cease and desist? Harvey Smith and fellow Arcane Austin veterans announced a new studio called Black Pony Immersive. They will design and develop first-person action RPGs. Is this game an action RPG? Dishonored. I mean, it had action in it, and it kind of had some RPG elements, so I guess technically it would be an action RPG. I don't think they own the rights to Dishonored, but also I think that story may very well be finished. Of course, their most recent game was Redfall, so you probably should expect something closer to Redfall than Dishonored games from them. But yeah, we can only hope that they do better. Then hundreds of union workers rally across North America to protest Xbox layoffs. I think this story is actually particularly old, but I wouldn't be surprised if the rallies and strikes are still happening. Okay, so here's where I have to make some decisions, and I have to make them quickly. I didn't do any of the warm-up that I would have done in previous streams, and I jumped directly into the news. So effectively we are done with the news, but I still have, either on screen or off screen, a ton of games that are new to Steam that don't have AI tagged on them that I want to look at, and some of the warm-up stuff I really do want to show off, but I think we probably will show it off very quickly. We'll look at the 24-hour peak concurrent chart on SteamDB. We can see how the fish has jumped up to number 4, so it is hugely successful. Palworld is still very successful. And let's just scroll down this once and see if there's anything else I really want to mention. It is interesting, to say the least, to look at this chart when I'm much more awake, but also I'm a little surprised I am awake at this point, because we are potentially on the verge of when I would start to get sleepy. We can see Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel, which I use for background music in this game, in the streams. I don't think I'm ever gonna show any more Yu-Gi-Oh! Though. I was only doing that when I was live streaming and taking breaks. And we can see Witcher 3 Wild Hunt Complete Edition probably is jumping up in the numbers with people playing it, perhaps even before they get the remaster upgrade. And then we'll look at the most wishlisted games. If the game is going to, if my tabs are going to be kind enough to me and not jump around. Deadlock is the game that is being worked on Valve and by Valve, and that could have been what they released for their 30th anniversary. It is interesting to look at like what games we haven't seen anything new from, such as Fable at Gamescom. Does that tell us much? Not really. It just tells us that maybe Microsoft doesn't care about Gamescom, and there might be a deeper story to investigate there as far as how many Microsoft games actually were shown at Gamescom, or did they just fully snub it? But yeah, there is probably a long list of games amongst this top 100 most wishlisted list that still aren't anywhere close to being released, and they just don't have anything new to show. Clockwork Revolution is one of those. It might also be that some of these games might be very close to being released, so there might not be a real reason to show a trailer for something that's coming out just in a couple weeks. I imagine a lot of these games, though, also have just gone full silent until they see what happens to GTA 6. Which, there is an interesting thought certainly there, in that it is very possible that game developers other than Rockstar are just very much delighting. 101 years ago, Kimura Pharmaceuticals was established. They must have made a video game at some point, or licensed a video game or something. I assume Kimura Pharmaceuticals isn't some fake company from like a Resident Evil game or something. That would be weird. The Moby Games This Day in History might be a great way to search games that Dolly Parton may have been in. I know Dolly Parton has this library, book donation charity. I looked at that, and like the default donation they want is $31, which you're sending digitally. Seems like a lot for a default donation, but $31 probably is the cost of even getting one child's book new and in good shape and then shipping it somewhere. But yeah, you can also put in lesser amounts of money. Yeah. Definitely kids need to read more and improve their literacy. It is rather bad. And I think we really are at the point now where it's just give every single teenage boy Dragon Ball manga and every single teenage girl Sailor Moon manga, or maybe just give them all Dragon Ball and Sailor Moon, frankly, and not gender it at all, at a early age, 10 or 11. Just get them into reading manga. Don't worry about the quality of the content, just get them obsessed with it and reading it. Manga is not even that many words, but it is probably more words than a comic book, and let's be honest, most kids aren't reading comic books either. Just start them off reading anything and learn to love reading something. Unfortunately, there was a hope that went unfulfilled with the internet, that you would be reading a lot on the internet and that it would actually be good information. But no, not really. Like, this list here is saying bare minimal of information, not even complete sentences in most cases. And leet speak and videos and audio really took over the internet as far as what's actually being absorbed. And kids are watching a lot of TikTok like sites and YouTube, so there's no real literacy improvement there. There's also the case that hurts literacy in general when people are not being challenged to learn new words or be able to figure out how to at least sound out the words or look up the definition of the words. So a lot of times I think people are taught vocabulary lists of words and simple words, and then they have no way of learning anything new or even really understanding the meanings of the words. So yeah, it's a pretty big concern. Now the problem here with going back only 3 days for this day in history is we should be going back 7 days, and that's a lot of scrolling, and I really am running it low on time. So there is really an argument to dropping this day in history and dropping a lot of these warm-up pages in my streams. I imagine we are now at the point, now that I'm not actually talking about video game news, where interest would fall down low if I get any views in to begin with. But yeah, I'm going to have to reconsider if I'm going to do weekly streams. Am I going to go through 7 pages of this day in gaming history? Or am I going to just drop it completely? Those are pretty much the only 2 options. It doesn't make a lot of sense to just stay with 3 or to do just 1. You could make an argument to do just 1, but I mean, that is just going to be very random and unfair to all the previous days. Yeah. And then there certainly are going to be other issues with some of the other things, such as just looking at what is on the Steam front page. That tends not to be that important. And it may very well be the case that for like the Steam front page, I will show it if there is actually a sale going on or something I actually want to talk about, and that should just be part of my setup work. And if there's really nothing new to talk about, then I would just not bother to show it. Yeah. For the most part, this day in gaming history have really just been lists I've scrolled down very quickly, and on a rare occasion I'll see something that catches my interest. But yeah, I could see talking about the gacha revenue for mobile games only once a month, since it only gets updated once a month anyways, and we could probably find a specific Wednesday once a month that will tend to be the slowest days. As for mobile games, I'm still making good progress on Pokemon TCG Pocket of having almost all the cards and getting all of the solo challenges. I guess if I fully catch up, I should just start playing player versus player. And I'm still making progress in Memento Mori, just slow, kind of grinding progress. I'm increasingly realizing as I try to expand the guild on one of my accounts that there is basically nobody playing on that server, and it is just incredibly stagnant because of that, which that is definitely the problem of having a mobile game that has multiple servers, and it really didn't need to have multiple servers even from day one. The idea of multiple servers was to, I imagine, attract new players to play on the newer servers and have a more even playing field, but that really doesn't work that well in the long run. The Steam hardware survey, I barely talk about it anyways, but once a month makes a lot of sense for that. I have been playing The Artisan of Glimmerth, I mentioned that earlier. I have 41 of 57 achievements. It says I have 216 hours in it. More realistically, I'm closer to 70 hours in the game, and it is slow and grindy, certainly as a game goes. Steam front page, you would think might highlight something more for Gamescom, but all we have is this page. Then discounts I really can't afford. Yeah. In fact, I very much am in a stupid situation where I've spent a little extra more than I couldn't probably afford after even realizing that 2 out of my main bills are likely going to be very expensive this month, electricity and water. And certainly it would be weird if there was a huge game that came out in the middle of all these Gamescom announcements, which that is definitely another point against these kinds of events like Gamescom or Video Games Award or Summer Game Fest, is that it is very much taking away from the attention that would be better placed on games that are actually available to play and buy now. I call that sucking the oxygen out of the room. Well, many people call it that. But yeah, there really isn't anything too big going on. As developers and publishers, well, I probably own so many games that technically I know a ton of developers and publishers. Let's see what the Gamescom 2026 has to highlight. A lot of fairly big games, and arguably this may be the better way to look at games from Gamescom. Is if you're a Steam only gamer, look at the Steam page. New Worms game is surprising and definitely feels like something we didn't hear. I didn't see any of my news sources talk about. This game Murals looks interesting too. This Genie Gods Naza, don't think I saw any article about that. Yeah, even though I think my news sources are kind of thorough and I have several of them, it does seem very much like they skipped over about 3. What was that button that I just did? Split tabs in Firefox. I didn't even know you could do that. Well, you definitely wouldn't want that in a vertical setup, but I could see if you had a big widescreen monitor, that would make sense. Then when we're below this point, we're seeing quite a few games that maybe are at Gamescom, but aren't actually getting trailers on the screen at the big opening night presentation. Yeah, we've got this Anada game which this is a urban open RPG game. I heard it described as more of like an anime GTA game, which would be very interesting if an anime GTA game somehow became more popular and beat GTA 6. This Perceptum game might be interesting. Weirdly, that because that was split though, it didn't activate any of my scripts, so I had to reload the page. Murals also looks like it might be something. Yeah. Nesha, apparently we looked at on February 2nd. Still not a release date. And yeah, Steam Deck recertified. I definitely am only going to show this page if there actually are some in stock. And even then, it's probably going to be too late by the time the videos stream. And then we'll go through the Steam top played games. Now what's funny about this is we're about 3 hours and 40 minutes into the stream. So I was getting it down to 2 hours and 30 minutes. We didn't double it to 5 hours, which was a concern, and frankly there's a real concern that it will triple to 7.5 hours, and that is in the case of talking about Gamescom announcements, which, yeah, that is intriguing, to say the least. So if I had more time, which I don't, I might go through all the new games on Steam in the future, but I could also see that I don't do that because there is just a ton of games, and instead what I would do is go through the games that came out new on Steam, put them on my follow list, or pretend like I'm going to make YouTube shorts on them, and then do that while my recorded footage, which I'm recording right now, plays back. Because yeah, at this point I am just going to have a few minutes to take a break and then watch my footage that I've recorded play back and start it playing back and watch the chat and see how that goes. And we'll just see what happens and see if I can just consistently be in the chat. It may more than likely be a case where as I get more used to this, I will check the chat and then take a 10-minute break and then come back and check the chat again, depending on how active the chat really is. Yeah, there really is no guarantee that there won't be times when I straight up just let the pre-recording play and don't even watch the chat. Alright, well, mostly because I'm out of time, that is going to be the end of this show. As always, I ask you to like, share, subscribe, comment on how you think this worked, and watch every second of my videos so I can try and get those 8,000 hours